Something was breathing inside the well. I crouched by the dried-up well in the backyard of the inn. My nose almost touched the moss growing on the rim. I picked up 3 distinct scents. The first was the sour rot of decaying wood soaking in stagnant water. It smelled like a slop bucket left out overnight. The second was the greasy stench of kitchen waste. The landlady dumped her dishwater here every day, leaving layers of pork fat and cabbage scraps to fester on the stones. Then there was the third scent. It was faint. It smelled like rusted iron. No, it was more like the ash of burnt joss paper mixed with spit and smeared into the cracks of the bricks. It was a cold, seeping smell. I had encountered this scent once before in the mountains. 3 years ago, I tracked a lame wild boar across a rocky clearing. Its blood had dried on the stones under the sun for 2 days. That smell was metallic and burnt. But that boar's blood was dead. This scent was alive. It was moving. It felt like something was trapped inside the walls of the well, breathing in and out. I pressed my index and middle fingers together, sliding them along the cracks in the bricks. My fingertips were covered in thick calluses from years of drawing bows and wrestling boar tusks. I could feel things most people couldn't. When I reached the third brick, a chill shot through my hand. Something was stuck in the gap. I pried it out. It was a small piece of red cloth. The edges were charred, and the center was stained with a dark, brownish crust. I sniffed it. There was no smell, but my scalp went numb. I didn't need to smell it. I could see it. The brown stain was shaped exactly like a pinky finger. It was perfect. I could see all 5 creases of the joints. In these mountains, people were superstitious. When a child was born, they wrapped the baby's first hair in red cloth and hid it under a pillow for luck. When a child died, they wrapped the body in red cloth and buried it under an old locust tree. This cloth belonged to a child. I tucked the scrap into my shirt and stood up. I glanced back at the inn. On the second floor, the corner window was shut, but a flickering yellow light glowed through the paper pane. That was Manager Zhao's office. He was in his 50s and usually only lit a single candle to save money. Tonight, that flame was dancing wildly. It looked like someone was sitting right next to it, blowing on it over and over. I didn't use the front door. I climbed over the low backyard wall. A roof tile cracked under my foot. It wasn't loud, but the light in the second-floor window vanished instantly. I looked back. A face was pressed against the window paper. I couldn't see the features, just a blurry, flesh-colored mass. It slid slowly down the pane, like a person collapsing into a ball on the floor. I picked up my pace. I didn't go back to my shack. Instead, I headed for the Earth God Temple at the east end of town. It was barely a temple, just a half-collapsed brick room with a clay statue. Someone had smashed half the statue's head off, and some joker had drawn a mustache on the remaining half. There was no incense on the altar. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, trapping a dried-out grasshopper. I crawled under the altar and pulled out a broken stone bowl. I'd found it in a cave in the back mountains. The bottom was covered in cracks that looked like a dry riverbed. It looked just like the cheap bowls old hunters used for medicine. I had brought it home, cleaned it, and left it on my windowsill to catch rainwater. The next morning, the water hadn't evaporated. It had increased. A tiny speck of light, glowing like a firefly's tail, sat at the bottom of the bowl. It was warm to the touch. Since that day, I started hearing things. At first, it was just my own breathing at night. But then I could hear the blood thumping through my heart valves. When the neighbor slaughtered a pig, I could hear the echo of every single drop of blood hitting the wooden basin through 2 thick walls. Then came the crying, an infant's cry. Every night at the stroke of midnight, it drifted from the direction of the inn. It sounded muffled, like someone was covering the baby's mouth. I asked Old Man Lu, the local fortune teller, about it. He squinted at me and told me I was haunted. He told me to donate money to a temple and pray for 3 days. I didn't believe him. Hunting taught me one thing. If you run from what you fear, it will chase you. You have to crouch down. You have to see what it is, where it comes from, and what it eats. I sat under the altar and lit 3 sticks of cheap incense. They smelled like acrid ink. As the smoke rose, my fingers began to shake. The 3 thin lines of smoke didn't drift away. They twisted together like a snake and dived into the largest crack at the bottom of the stone bowl. Then, my head exploded. A woman was sobbing. It was a suppressed, choking sound. An infant was wheezing, a sound caught between a laugh and a cry, thick with phlegm. A man was giggling. He laughed until he couldn't breathe. I heard a sharp crack, like porcelain shattering on stone. Then came the smells: burnt paper, sour, fermented rice wine, and the suffocating, musty stench of a coffin being pried open after decades underground. It all slammed into my skull at once. It felt like someone was shoving a red-hot wire into my ears. I collapsed to my knees, gagging. The veins in my neck bulged. My teeth ground together. But I didn't move. I gripped the edges of the bowl so hard my fingernails turned white. When the incense burned out, the smoke retreated from the cracks and vanished. A new speck of light sat at the bottom of the bowl. It was the size of a grain of rice, glowing and translucent. Inside the light, I saw a face. It was a baby's face. It was deathly pale. The lips were pulled back into a terrifying grin. Its eyes were shut, but two dark red lines ran from the corners of its eyes all the way to its ears. The light flickered and merged into the skin of my forehead. It felt ice-cold, like licking a frozen metal gate in winter. A vision flashed in my mind. An old locust tree. A hole dug at the roots. A layer of red cloth sat at the bottom of the pit, wrapping something the size of a child. Tree roots snaked around the bundle. I heard footsteps. Someone walked over and knelt. A pair of rough, calloused hands reached down to pull the red bundle out. I noticed one detail. The person's right pinky finger was missing a section. It was gone from the second joint up. The vision snapped shut. When I opened my eyes, the sky was turning gray. Sparrows were chirping outside. The incense ash on the altar was still warm. I looked at my hands. They were shaking so badly I could barely hold the bowl. But I smiled. I stood up, brushed the dirt off my knees, and tucked the bowl away. I stepped out into the morning mist. I headed toward the house of Lee the Lame. Lee was a basket weaver. Everyone in town knew he had lost part of his pinky 3 years ago when a bamboo strip cut him and the wound turned rotten. He'd cut it off himself with shears. But the finger I saw in the vision was different. The cut was clean. It had been taken with a knife. By the time I reached his house, the sun was up. The front gate was wide open. Lee the Lame sat on his doorstep, weaving a bamboo basket. The bamboo strips flew through his fingers, over and under, leaving a pile of green shavings at his feet. He looked up and saw me. He offered a small, tired smile. He asked if I was there to buy a basket so early in the morning. I didn't answer. I kept my eyes fixed on his right hand. His pinky was definitely missing a section, but the scar was old. The flesh had smoothed over and turned a dark, leathery brown, like dried tree bark. That injury was at least 10 years old. I told him I wasn't there for a basket. I told him I was there to ask a question. He told me to go ahead. I asked him who Boss Zhao had been fighting with for business 3 years ago. The bamboo strip in Lee's hand paused for a fraction of a second before he resumed weaving. He tried to act natural, but I saw it. His left ring finger twitched, as if he'd been pricked by a needle. He played dumb. He said there were many business rivalries and asked which one I meant. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "The one involving your son." The bamboo strip fell to the ground. Lee froze on the doorstep. The skin on his face seemed to sag, turning limp and wrinkled like a piece of wet paper that couldn't hold its shape anymore. It took him a long time to find his voice. When he finally spoke, it sounded like his throat was stuffed with cotton. He asked me who I'd heard that from. I didn't say a word. I knelt in front of him, pulled the small piece of red cloth from my robe, and spread it out on my knees. Lee took one look at it and slid right off the doorstep. He collapsed onto the muddy ground, his lips trembling and his teeth chattering. Tears welled up from beneath his wrinkled eyelids, flowing down the deep furrows of his face and dripping onto the bamboo shavings. He choked out that it belonged to Xiao Bao, his son. The boy was only 3 when he died of smallpox. He started to curse Boss Zhao, calling him a bastard, but he suddenly cut himself off. He looked up at me, his grief instantly replaced by pure terror. He was staring at the stone bowl in my hand. From a crack in the bottom, a single drop of black water was seeping out. It crawled down the side of the bowl, hung off the rim for a second, and splashed into the mud. Lee backed away, scrambling half a foot across the ground. He stammered, asking who I was. I flipped the stone bowl over. The black water drained into the soil and vanished. I tucked the bowl back into my clothes and stood up. I patted Lee on the shoulder. I told him I was here to return his son. Then, I gave him a warning. I told him not to leave his house tonight before midnight. No matter who called his name, he wasn't to answer. I turned to leave. After 3 steps, I stopped. Without looking back, I told him that if the lamp in Boss Zhao's accounting room went out tonight, he should come to the Earth Temple tomorrow morning to offer incense. Then, I walked away. Behind me, Li the Lame sat alone among the bamboo scraps, gasping for air, his eyes filled with a mix of tears and dread. I walked back through the town's cobblestone streets. Passing the general store, I went inside to buy another bundle of incense. The shopkeeper's wife was setting out candles. She looked surprised to see me. She called me Little Yi and asked why I was back when I'd just bought a bundle yesterday. I placed 3 copper coins on the counter and told her I'd used them all up. She shook her head and reached under the counter for the incense. As she handed it over, she suddenly flinched and pulled her hand back. She pointed at my forehead. Right between my eyebrows, there was a thin red line, like a shallow cut from a fingernail. A tiny bead of blood was oozing out. She asked what happened to my head. I touched the spot, and my fingertip came back red. I wiped the blood on my pant leg and took the incense with a smile. I told her it was nothing, just a run-in with a spider web. By the time I left the shop, the sun was high over the old locust tree at the town entrance. The trunk was thick, and the soil at its base had been recently disturbed, covered now by a layer of withered leaves. I stood there for a moment before kneeling down. I brushed the leaves aside. The dirt was loose. I dug down about half a foot until my fingers brushed against something soft and red. I didn't dig any further. I filled the hole back in, patted the dirt down, and covered it with leaves. I stood up and brushed the mud off my hands. Tonight, I was going to make Boss Zhao break the thing in that well himself. I needed a well, a stick of incense, a line of text, and a severed finger. As I walked toward the inn, the stone bowl in my pocket grew warm. Another drop of black water seeped from the crack, but this time it didn't fall. It swirled around the bottom of the bowl, hardening into a tiny black bead. It rolled to the center and stopped. It looked exactly like a human pupil. Later that night, I crouched by the dry well in the inn's backyard. I held an unlit incense stick in my hand. The window on the 2nd floor was still lit. Boss Zhao's candle flickered inside. It seemed steadier than the night before, but every 15 minutes, the flame would jump violently, as if something had just brushed past the candlestick. I was waiting for the purple stone hour, the time when restless spirits cry. I started to count. 1, 2, 3. On the 15th count, the temperature in the backyard plummeted. My breath turned into white mist. A thin layer of frost bloomed on the rim of the well. Then I heard it. A crying sound. It drifted up from beneath my feet, deep within the well. The sound traveled up the long stone shaft, echoing off the walls like a small hammer striking a cracked bell. I didn't move. I sat by the edge, brought the incense stick to my lips, and exhaled. My breath dampened the tip. I tucked the incense behind my ear and pulled out the stone bowl. The black bead was still there, rolling around the center. Everywhere it touched, tiny, hair-thin cracks lit up like shattering ice. I turned the bowl upside down over the well. The bead stopped dead in the center. Then it throbbed. Once, like a heartbeat. The crying at the bottom of the well stopped. There were 2 heartbeats of absolute silence. Then, a different sound drifted up. It wasn't crying anymore. It was breathing. A heavy inhale, a pause, and a long exhale. It was that same smell of living rust I'd encountered yesterday. Something had woken up. I flipped the bowl back over, tucked it away, and stood up. I climbed over the low wall and circled to the front of the inn. When I pushed the door open, I saw Boss Zhao slumped over the counter, asleep. A pot of cold tea sat beside him. I didn't wake him. I crept upstairs and pushed open the door to his accounting room. Only half a candle remained on the desk. A pool of melted wax had hardened into a white crust. The ledger was open to yesterday's date, the ink long dry. I pulled a piece of charcoal I'd gathered from the temple's incense burner. On the blank space of the last page, I scrawled a line of messy text. Did you hear him? He's crying inside the bell. He says he wants to come out and find you. I put the charcoal away, closed the ledger, and blew out the candle. As I left the inn, I glanced back at the 2nd floor window. There was no face behind the paper this time. But the window latch, despite the lack of wind, rattled on its own. It sounded just like a bell. I tightened my collar and stepped into the darkness at the edge of town. In the distance, the canopy of the old locust tree looked like a hunched figure silhouetted against the moon. Tomorrow morning, when Boss Zhao opened that ledger, there would be something new in the well. Inside my pocket, the black bead in the stone bowl cracked open. A thin wisp of white smoke drifted out, spiraling upward. It circled the red line on my forehead before vanishing into my temple. A single word echoed in my mind. Thank you. It was the voice of a baby. I touched the red line. The blood had dried. I looked up at the moon and smiled. I started walking back toward the Earth Temple. I had to get up early. There would be people waiting to offer incense tomorrow. The tea from last night had gone cold. Boss Zhao picked up the pot and took a massive gulp, getting a mouthful of bitter tea dregs in the process. Outside, the sky was still pitch black. The first rooster of the morning crowed at the edge of town. She lit a candle and flipped open her ledger. Her father had taught her that a business owner who doesn't balance the books every day hasn't truly lived that day. She remembered yesterday's earnings clearly. 2 of the 3 upstairs rooms were occupied. A fabric merchant had stayed in the west wing. That was 81 for the room, plus 5 for a bowl of hot noodles with an extra egg. When she reached the last page, her fingers froze. There was a new line of text on the paper. The charcoal strokes were crooked and messy, looking like the tracks of a crawling rat, but she recognized every single word. Did you hear her? She's crying inside the bell. She says she wants to come out and find you. Boss Zhao stared at those words for a long time. The candle burned beside her hand, and a bead of hot wax dripped onto her thumb. The sting made her flinch. The ledger slipped from her desk, landing face down on the floor. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she slowly turned around. She looked at the rosewood display shelf in the corner. On the 3rd tier sat a bronze bell. She had bought that bell 3 years ago from a traveling Taoist. He told her it was a wealth-attracting bell. He said if she kept it in her accounting room and flicked it 3 times a day, the money would never stop flowing. She believed him. The first day she brought it home, she rang it 3 times. That very night, every single room in her inn was booked solid. But that night, she dreamed. She dreamed of a child crying until its voice went hoarse. One sob after another, without even a pause to catch a breath. When she woke up the next morning, her pillow was soaked. It wasn't sweat. It was tears. Her own tears. From then on, she heard the crying every night. Sometimes it came from the neighboring yard, sometimes from her own backyard, and sometimes it sounded like it was right under her pillow. She offered incense at the temple and bought charms from priests, but nothing worked. Eventually, she tracked down the traveling Taoist again. He told her she was haunted by resentment. He said she had to take the crying thing, capture it, and refine it into a spiritual tool. Use resentment to suppress resentment. The crying thing the Taoist spoke of was the son of Lamely. She still remembered what she did that night. She had climbed over the back wall and dug beneath the old locust tree at Lamely's place. Her hands shook so hard she could barely hold the shovel. When she finally pulled out the red cloth bundle, it was incredibly light. It felt like holding a ball of cotton. She didn't dare look inside. She shoved it into her robe and climbed back over the wall. After that night, the crying stopped. Her pillow stayed dry. Business got better and better. She thought the nightmare was over. Still, she never dared to leave the bell on her desk. She kept it on the top shelf, hidden under a piece of yellow silk. Every time she walked past it, she moved as fast as she could. Now, looking at the words in the ledger, Boss Zhao reached down and picked the book up. She looked at the text again. This time, she noticed something else. Beneath the writing, there was a small, dark red smudge. It looked like someone had written the message and then pressed a finger onto the paper. The mark wasn't large, but she recognized the shape. It was a pinky finger. 5 joints, clenched into a tiny fist. A memory flashed in her mind. 3 years ago, when she had reached into the dirt to grab that red bundle, a tree root had been tangled around the cloth. She had yanked it hard. The root snapped, but the sap bleeding from the break was red. It was thick and sticky. It got all over her hand. She had run home and scrubbed her hands 3 times until her fingernails were raw. But that red stain stayed on the pad of her right pinky finger for half a month before it finally faded. She looked down at her right hand now. The finger was clean. There was nothing there. Boss Zhao slammed the ledger shut. She stood up and walked to the display shelf. She reached for the bronze bell. Her fingers trembled against the yellow silk 3 times before she found the courage to pull it back. Then, she heard it. There was movement inside the bell. It wasn't the crisp ring of metal hitting metal. It was muffled. It sounded like someone was inside a metal box, dragging their fingernails across the surface. Asterisk scratch. 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 Asterisk. 3 times. Slow and deliberate. The sound circled the inner wall of the bell. Boss Zhao's knees went weak. She leaned against the shelf for support, nearly knocking over a porcelain vase. She didn't care. She stared at the bell. Under the silk, the bell began to move. Very slowly, it rotated half a turn clockwise. She wants to come out and find you. The words from the ledger exploded in her head. Her throat tightened, as if an invisible hand were squeezing her windpipe. She opened her mouth to scream for help, but the air leaving her lungs made a strange, wet sound. A rattling noise, like an infant with phlegm in its throat. She lunged forward and grabbed the bell. The silk cloth fluttered to the floor. The metal felt searing hot against her palm. She flipped the bell over and saw a crack on the base. 3 jagged lines branched out from the center, and the edges of the cracks were stained black. She remembered clearly that the bell had been perfect 3 years ago. Snap! A sharp sound echoed from between her fingers. It sounded like an eggshell being crushed in a fist. She looked down. A 4th crack had just appeared on the base. Then she heard it clearly. A baby's voice squeezed out from the cracks. It was part sob, part whimper, and part laugh. "Come out then," she hissed. Her voice was so hoarse, she didn't recognize it. The bell went silent. Boss Zhao raised it high above her head. She leaned back, her wrist cocked, and then she hurled the bell with all her might against the doorframe. The bronze slammed into the hard wood with a dull thud. It bounced off and hit the floor, rolling into the corner. The 4 cracks shattered simultaneously. Shards of metal sprayed across the room. A dull yellow piece of bronze landed near the threshold. The break was fresh, showing the bright color of the metal, but the inner wall of the shard was coated in something. It was semi-transparent, like dried resin or sun-melted amber. Within the substance, there was a faint outline. Boss Zhao knelt down. Her fingers shook as she picked up the shard and held it against the morning light filtering through the window. Inside that amber-like coating, there was a face. It was tiny. The eyebrows were just 2 faint arcs. The lips were pressed together, the corners curling upward into the beginning of a smile. But the eyes were tightly shut. Boss Zhao squeezed the shard in her palm. She collapsed to her knees by the door, pressing her forehead against the wood. Her shoulders heaved. She didn't make a sound, but her back shook like she was shivering in a gale. She stayed there for 15 minutes. Then, she heard a sharp crack from the backyard. It sounded like something brittle shattering against stone. Boss Zhao stood up slowly. She pushed open the door and headed downstairs. She didn't even glance at the front desk as she walked through the narrow door leading to the rear courtyard. She stopped at the edge of the dry well. There was no one there. A broken bowl sat on the well's rim. A crack ran through the bottom of the bowl, and something was seeping out of it. A thin wisp of white smoke, like the final trail from a burnt stick of incense, curled into the air and drifted down into the depths of the well. Boss Zhao leaned over the edge. It was pitch black down there. She couldn't see the bottom, but she could smell it. It smelled of rusted iron and burnt paper, mixed with the damp scent of spit on old bricks. Then, from the bottom of the well, she heard a single cry. A baby's cry. It was short, stopping almost as soon as it began. Then came the silence. But it wasn't a cold silence. It was warm and heavy, like the air under a thick blanket in the middle of winter. I stood by the well, looking down. Suddenly, a sharp sting hit my nose. I smelled it milk. It was a faint, clean scent, like a newborn baby. I didn't say anything. I knelt, placed the copper shard I was holding onto the rim of the well, and walked away. The next morning, 3 sticks of incense appeared at the Earth Temple on the east side of town. They were stuck into a broken clay jar on the offering table, the same jar I'd used for ash yesterday. But this incense was new, the expensive sandalwood kind from the general store. 5 cents a bundle. I sat in the temple, watching them burn. As the smoke rose, I smelled the sandalwood, but there was something else wrapped inside it. It was warm and soft, like the scent of a cotton quilt that had been soaking up the sun all day. When the ash finally fell into the jar, the stone bowl in my shirt grew warm. It wasn't hot, just a gentle heat, like someone had pressed a cup of hot tea into my hands. I pulled it out. Next to the main crack at the bottom, two of the smaller, jagged fractures had vanished. It was as if something had filled them in. At the very center of the bowl, a thin layer of white ash had gathered. I rubbed it with my finger. Underneath the ash, the rough pottery had changed. A shallow, circular indentation had appeared, about the size of a baby's fist. I tucked the bowl back into my clothes and stood up, brushing the dust off my pants. I wasn't the only one at the temple today. As I pushed the door open, I ran into Old Joe, the town's herbalist. He stopped in his tracks, looking surprised. "Little Yi, what are you doing lurking in there?" "Just resting," I said. He leaned in closer, squinting at my face. "What's with that red line on your forehead?" The mark between my eyebrows had already formed a thin scab. It looked like a fine red thread embedded in my skin. "Probably just internal heat," Old Joe muttered. "I'll grab you some herbs to clear that up." "No need," I smiled. "It'll be gone in a couple of days." He didn't push it. He shouldered his tool and started to walk away, but stopped after a few steps. "Hey, did Lee the cripple open his sauce shop this morning?" "He did," I replied. "It's open." Old Joe scratched his head. "Strange. I walked past his place last night and heard someone crying all night long. I thought something bad had happened." I didn't answer. I stood by the temple door and watched him fade into the distance. Then I looked up. The sun was just hitting the top of the old locust tree at the entrance of the town. The light wasn't harsh yet. It filtered through the leaves, scattering golden spots across the ground. Suddenly, a voice echoed in my head. "Do enough wicked things, and retribution will find you." The voice was soft, like a thought someone hadn't quite spoken aloud. But I heard it clearly. It had the same tone as the "thank you" I'd heard the night before, but this time it was deeper, with a slight gravelly edge. I turned toward the sound. An old man in a gray cloth shirt was sitting outside the tea house, holding a bowl of tea and chatting with a neighbor. His lips were moving, but I didn't hear his spoken words. I heard what he was thinking. Boss Zhao's face was white as paper this morning. I saw him coming out of the backyard looking like he'd lost his soul. His pant legs were soaked halfway up. I looked away and tucked my hands into my sleeves, stepping back into the ruined temple. The red mark on my forehead leaked a tiny drop of blood. It slid down the bridge of my nose. I wiped it with my sleeve, leaving a red streak on the fabric. The stone bowl warmed up again. This time, the heat lasted longer, about 3 breaths before fading. Inside that small circular indentation, a new object had appeared. It looked like the grain of light from yesterday, but the color was deeper. It was a milky white bead, like dried rice water. It rolled around the pit for a second before sinking in, becoming part of the bowl. I touched my forehead. The bleeding had stopped. A small bump had grown under the scab. New, tender flesh. It felt like a grain of rice embedded under my skin. I closed the temple door and looked at the offering table. The incense had burned out. I poured the warm ash onto the table and drew a circle in it with my finger. I stared at the circle for a long time. The ash in the center looked thicker than the rest, as if something had just stepped there. I looked up at the rafters. The spider webs were still there. The dry grasshopper was still there. But now, there were 3 fresh claw marks in the wood. 4-toed, with the rounded marks of fleshy pads. I blew the thick ash away and clapped my hands clean. "Don't be in such a hurry," I whispered to the empty rafters. "It's still early." Nothing moved above me, but the pile of ash on the table suddenly shifted. It scattered outward from the center, as if someone had just leaned over and blown on it. I smiled and walked out. The town was coming to life now, columns of cooking smoke rising into the sky. As I passed the general store, the owner's wife was setting out vegetable baskets. "Little Yi, was that incense enough for you?" "It was," I said. "I don't need any today." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Boss Zhao's in his clothes today. Word is he's sick. I walked by this morning and saw a sign on the door. Closed for 3 days. Can you believe it? That man doesn't even close for New Year's." I gave a non-committal grunt and kept walking. "There's something even weirder," she whispered, following me a step. "Before dawn, Someone saw a man in a gray Taoist robe standing under that old locust tree. He was holding a compass, turning it around for ages. When they asked who he was looking for, he didn't say a word. He just left. I stopped. Which way did he go? She thought for a second. North, I think. But he stood under that tree for the time it takes to burn a stick of incense. When he left footprints in the dirt. 2 of them. Very shallow, but both toes were pointing straight toward our town. I nodded to her and hurried back to the temple. Once inside, I pulled out the stone bowl. The milky white bead was still there, firmly embedded. I held it up to my eye. Inside the bead, there was a tiny black thread. It was thinner than a human hair, swimming around in the white space. It darted from one side to the other, bouncing off the walls of the bead. When I flipped the bowl over, the black thread sank to the bottom and went still. The dirt that man in the gray robe stepped on, it would be black. I knew the smell he'd leave behind. Rust, burnt paper, the stale, suffocating air of a coffin that had been sealed for decades. It was the exact same scent I'd smelled in the cracks of that well. I tucked the bowl away and grabbed a short knife from under the offering table. It was my hunting knife, the edge worn white from sharpening. The back of the blade had 3 deep nicks from the last time I'd fought a wild boar on the mountain. I slid the knife into my belt and headed for the slope behind the temple. From there, I could see the canopy of the old locust tree. I was going to sit there and wait for him to come back. The stone bowl warmed against my chest. This time, it was a little hotter. Inside, the black thread wasn't swimming anymore. It was slamming itself against the wall of the bead. Once, twice, over and over. 3 strikes. The black thread inside the bead slammed against the wall of the stone bowl 3 times. It felt like someone knocking on a door. Yi Chun, quickened my pace. I didn't look back, but my ears were twitching. A hunter's ears are different from a normal person's. I can hear a wild boar snapping a dry branch from 2 miles away. This morning, when that man in the gray robe left the town entrance, his footsteps had a strange sound. It was a dry rustle, like he was stepping on crushed copper plates. I had heard that exact same sound yesterday, right outside the innkeeper's office. Ding! It sounded like a tiny bell. I didn't bother looking for footprints. Instead, I sat on a large green rock for half an hour. The sun climbed from the tops of the locust trees to the middle of the sky, baking the stone until it was hot. I stripped off my outer coat and used it as a cushion. My hunting knife lay across my knees, the sharp edge facing outward. The mountain wind blew in from the north, carrying the scent of freshly turned soil from the tea fields. Then I saw him. A gray shadow rounded the bend of the northern mountain path near the old locust tree. He walked slowly toward the town. He wore a gray Taoist robe and had a tall, thin frame. He walked with a limp, his left foot swung wide, and his right heel trailed behind with a shorter stride than a normal man. He had an old leg injury. I squinted. He wasn't carrying a compass. Instead, he held a cloth bag. The top was tied tight, but the bottom sagged heavily. Something hard and angular was inside, stretching the fabric into a sharp point. I stood up and slid my knife back into my belt. I didn't take the main path. I slid down a narrow trail on the back of the slope, a path I discovered when I was 12 while tracking a wounded deer. It led straight to the bamboo grove behind the old locust tree without passing a single house. As I descended, my fingers gripped tree roots in the rock crevices. My feet landed on pine needles. I made less noise than a mouse scurrying through dead leaves. I crouched at the edge of the bamboo grove, watching him from about 30 feet away. The gray-robed man stopped under the locust tree. He didn't enter the town. Instead, he started walking in a slow circle around the trunk. Before every step, he ground his toes into the dirt, as if testing the hardness of the ground. On the 3rd lap, he stopped. He knelt and brushed away the loose soil near the roots. I saw him pull something out. It was a tiny piece of copper, no bigger than a fingernail. It glinted yellow in the sunlight. He held the copper piece to his eyes, then brought it to his nose to sniff it. He reached into his bag, pulled out a small vial, uncorked it, and let a single drop of liquid fall onto the metal. The copper began to smoke. A thin, black wisp rose up, wobbling as it climbed, before dispersing into a gray mist. The mist didn't just vanish. It drifted toward the east end of town, right toward the Earth God Temple. The man stood up, tucked the copper into his robe, and patted the dust off his hands. He started walking toward the temple. I didn't hide. I stepped out of the bamboo grove and onto the small path, meeting him head-on. We stopped about 20 feet apart. The Taoist was as thin as a piece of dried firewood. His cheekbones were high and sharp, and the corners of his mouth sagged downward. But his eyes were terrifying. They were bright, too bright for a human. There was a faint ring of gold around his pupils, like a thin band of copper embedded in his eyes. He looked me up and down. His gaze swept from my forehead to my feet, lingering for a second on the notched knife at my waist. Then, his eyes locked onto the red mark between my eyebrows. He didn't look away. "You," he said. His voice was raspy, like sandpaper rubbing against iron. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. He took 2 steps forward, stopping about 3 paces from me. He leaned his head forward slightly, like a hawk inspecting a snake. He stared at the red mark on my brow for a long time. Then he suddenly smiled. His lips pulled back to reveal a row of yellow teeth. "Interesting," he whispered. "You've taken on that child's grievance." My fingers tightened behind my back. I didn't know what he meant by grievance, but I understood the words "that child." "You knew Li the Lame's son?" I asked. The Taoist didn't answer. He pulled the copper piece from his robe and tossed it lightly in his palm. "Have you seen this before?" There was a crack in the copper, with 3 black fissures branching out from the center. I had seen that exact pattern on the shards of the wealth-attracting bell that boss, Zhao, had smashed. I shook my head. "Never." He tucked it away and took another step forward. He was inside my personal space now. I could smell him. It was a mix of sour sweat, old incense ash, and that familiar scent of rust. It was the same smell I'd found in the cracks of the well, but much stronger, like a man who had been soaking in rusty water for 3 months. "Are you from the town?" he asked. "I'm a hunter." "A hunter?" He laughed again, showing even more of his yellow teeth. A hunter with a divine mark on his brow. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my face blank. I'd been dealing with predators in the mountains since I was 12. I'd been in tighter spots than this. My right hand moved slowly toward my waist, my thumb hooking over the hilt of my knife. He saw the movement and stepped back half a pace. Just half a pace. It was calculated. He was now exactly out of my reach. "Don't be nervous," he said. "I didn't come to fight you. I came to see the show. If it's wasted, it's wasted. I'm sure you have other bells." The Taoist froze. He stared at me for a few seconds, and then that dry, withered smile returned. This time, the smile reached his eyes, and the copper rings spun a full circle. "Interesting," he said again. "The thing you're carrying is much more useful than a child's spirit." He moved. I didn't even see him twitch. 1 second he was there. The next he was a gray blur. A sudden gust of wind hit me. My hunter's instincts made the decision for me. I lunged to the left and rolled across the dirt. As I rolled, I drew my knife and held it across my chest. Hissed, a faint sound of slicing air passed exactly where I had been standing. I looked back. A thin gray line hung in the air, fine as spider silk, extending from the Taoist's right index finger. It was pulled taut. Where the silk had passed, a thick stalk of bamboo had been sliced clean in 2. The cut was as smooth as if a hot blade had melted through it. I scrambled to my feet, knife pointed forward, knees bent. I didn't run. When you're being hunted by a wild boar in the mountains, you learn one thing very quickly. The man who turns his back to the predator doesn't live more than 3 breaths. The gray thread vanished, coiling back around his index finger until it disappeared. He didn't chase me. He just stood there, hands tucked into his sleeves, tilting his head like a curious bird. "You're not running?" he asked. "Where would I go?" I panted. My chest was heaving. "I'm the one watching over the earth god temple." He laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound that shook the bamboo leaves. "Watch over it," he mocked. "You're a mortal who hasn't even lit his divine fire. What could you possibly protect? That seed on your brow has barely sprouted. It hasn't even taken root. You don't even know what's in that bowl." My heart hammered against my ribs like a drum. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't his spoken words. It was a thought, loud and clear in my head, as if someone were whispering directly into my ear. "The godhead on this hunter is shattered, but the pieces are still there. If I take him back to the mountain gate and refine him, I could get a perfect batch of pills." The Taoist's lips didn't move. His thoughts were just spilling over, too full to stay contained. He looked at me and smiled, his Adam's apple bobbing. I won't take you today, he said. What you have is too raw. If I refined you now, I'd just get scrap. I'll give you 3 months. Let that seed ripen. Then, I'll come for it. He took a step forward. Remember, my name is Xinqing. 3 months from today, I'm coming to collect the debt. He turned and walked away. He didn't rush. He had a strange gait. His left foot dragged, and his right heel seemed too short, leaving shallow tracks in the pine needles. I stood frozen, knife still raised, my fingers trembling. I waited until his back disappeared into the bamboo before I finally lowered the blade. The handle was slick with sweat. I didn't walk. I ran. I bolted back to the temple faster than the time a wild boar chased me through the brush. I slammed the door and pulled the stone bowl from my robe. Inside, that black silk thread was thrashing wildly against the milky white bead. It sounded like fingernails scratching against stone. Scritch, scritch. It was the same sound the Taoist's gray thread made when it sliced the air. I flipped the bowl over on the altar and pressed down with all my weight. The bowl rattled 3 times, then went silent. When I turned it back over, the black thread had stopped moving. But it was thicker now. It coiled in the center like a sleeping snake. I slumped against the wall, my heart still racing. I looked at my hand. A splinter from the knife handle had sliced my palm, and a bit of blood was oozing out. I licked it. It was salty. This was real. 3 months, I whispered. Then I heard it. Thump, thump, thump. Someone was tapping on the altar. I looked over. The table was empty, but the incense ash I'd scattered earlier had pulled itself together. It formed a circle, the same one I'd drawn, but now there was a curved line inside. A smile. A lump formed in my throat. I reached out and brushed the ash away, blurring the face. I know, I said softly. I'm not rushing. I cracked the door and looked out. The sun was high. Smoke rose from the town's chimneys. The grocer's wife was gossiping loudly across the street. Everything looked normal, but I wasn't the same. I looked at my palm. The blood had dried. I squeezed my fist, feeling my knuckles crack. 3 months was enough time to do a lot of things. I needed to find this mountain gate. I needed to know what this seed was. And most importantly, I needed to see if this stone bowl could help me grow strong enough to face that gray thread. I stepped out into the sunlight. It hit the red mark on my brow, feeling warm, like a gentle finger rubbing the skin. I walked toward the center of town. As I passed Lame Lee's yard, he was busy chopping wood. Hey, little Yi, come over for dinner tonight, he shouted. We're stewing an old hen. Another time, I waved. That scar on your head still looks red, he called out, squinting at me. It's almost healed, I replied. As I walked past his gate, I heard a voice. The kid is tough. Just don't know how long he'll last. It was Lame Lee's thought. But then, a second voice drifted from beneath the old locust tree in his yard. It was softer, sweeter. Brother, be careful of the man in gray. I froze for a few heartbeats. I looked down at the bowl in my shirt. Inside the white bead, a tiny white line, thin as a hair, was swimming next to the black silk. When it drifted close, the black thread actually flinched away. I looked at the old tree and gave a small, barely visible nod. Then I kept moving. I needed to find the dog's den before it came to bite my throat. I headed to the tea house at the edge of town. The place was quiet. I ordered a bowl of the cheapest coarse tea and sat on a bench near the door, my back to the wall. A hunter's habit. From here, I could see every face in the room. I took a sip. It was bitter enough to make me wince. Whoa, little Yi, splurging on tea today? The owner, Fatty Wong, leaned over the counter, a dripping rag in his hand. Your hunting must be going well. I'm just here for information, I said, setting the bowl down. I'm looking for someone. Tall, thin, wearing a gray Taoist robe. He has a limp in his left foot. He was seen near the locust tree recently. The smile slid off Fatty Wong's face. He glanced around and leaned in close. You saw him? I did. That man is bad news, Wong whispered. He showed up last autumn, hanging around that same tree. 2 days after he left, Lujia Ao village up north went to hell. Everyone there had nightmares for 2 weeks straight. 7 families packed up and ran for their lives. I tapped my finger against the rim of the bowl. Where is Lujia Ao? 10 miles north, deep in the mountain hollow. Take the dirt road out of town, past 2 forks, then head east. You'll see a crooked walnut tree. That's the place. Fatty Wong finished talking and added one last thing. You're going there, aren't you? I'm not, I said. Just asking. Fatty Wong studied me for a long moment. His mouth opened as if he wanted to say something else, but he ultimately kept it shut. He stood up to head back to the counter, but after 2 steps, he turned back around. Little Yi, that scar on your forehead. Tomorrow morning, someone is coming to the Earth God Temple at the east end of town to burn incense. Are you going to see? My hand, holding the tea bowl, paused. Who's burning incense? Old Lady Li, the lame man's mother. Last night, her grandson came to her in a dream. He told her a hunter brother in town helped him out in a big way. He asked her to go to the temple, light 3 sticks of incense, and kowtow 3 times. I looked down and finished the coarse tea in 1 gulp. The liquid was so bitter it made my throat tighten, but I didn't flinch. I'll go, I said. I'll be there first thing tomorrow. When I stepped out of the tea house, the sun was already dipping toward the west. I didn't head back to the temple. Instead, I walked out of the town entrance and followed the dirt road north. The tea fields on both sides of the road had been plowed, and rows of dark brown earth stretched all the way to the foot of the mountains. Wild rabbits darted through the furrows. After walking for about 15 minutes, I reached the first fork. I turned east. The dirt path turned into a gravel road, overgrown with foxtail grass that swayed in the wind. At the second fork, I turned east again. Then I saw it, the crooked walnut tree. The trunk was twisted violently, looking like it had been wrung by a giant hand. It leaned heavily to the south, supported only by a few thick branches. Under the tree sat 3 stones arranged in a triangle. In the center lay a pile of burnt paper ash. A few chicken bones were mixed into the gray soot. I knelt down to examine the pile. The ash was fresh, 3 days old at most. The chicken bones had been gnawed clean. Not a single scrap of meat remained. But the teeth marks weren't human. They were too dense, too fine, like hundreds of needle points had scraped across the bone in rows. I'd seen marks like that in the mountains before. They belonged to a fox. But a fox can't eat a chicken this clean. A fox leaves deep tooth indentations. These bones were smooth, as if they'd been polished with sandpaper. I stood up and walked deeper into the mountain hollow. Yahello wasn't large. There were only about a dozen households. The houses were all built of stacked stone, and the courtyard walls were so low they looked like doorsteps. I reached the first courtyard. The door was ajar. I gave it a nudge, and it groaned open. The yard was empty. A thick layer of dust covered the stone mill. Half a garment hung from a clothesline, a blue cloth shirt with tattered sleeves, fluttering in the breeze. Near the mill, I spotted a few footprints. They were shallow, toes pointing toward the gate. Someone had walked out. I checked a few more houses, all empty. In one, a pot still sat on the stove with its lid on. I lifted it. A layer of black crust coated the bottom, porridge that had boiled dry and scorched. It had been dry for at least half a month. In the very last courtyard, I found something. There was a water vat. A bowl sat on the rim, half filled with leftover water. A single gray thread floated on the surface. I leaned in closer. It was identical to the one wrapped around the dark stone paper earlier. Thin as a hair. It drifted on the water, perfectly still. At the bottom of the bowl sat a few clumps of black residue, like burnt spirit money ash. I didn't touch the bowl. I walked around the vat and noticed a few words scrawled on the outer wall. The handwriting was crooked, written by a finger dipped in muddy water. Don't come in. I crouched to look at the strokes. The final flick of the first character dragged down a long way, cutting off near the base of the vat. The person who wrote this had been shaking violently. The lines were wavy, like the script of someone suffering a stroke. In the corner of the yard sat a chicken coop. 3 hens were huddled together inside. Their feathers were puffed out. They didn't run when they saw me. They just sat there, clucking and shivering. I reached out to touch the back of one. Its body temperature was high, much hotter than my palm. It felt like it had been running a fever all night. I stood up, walked out, and pulled the gate shut. I walked another half-mile into the hollow until the stone path vanished. It turned into a narrow trail hidden by wild grass. At the end of the trail stood a small compound. It was more of a gateway than a house. 3 stone rooms surrounding a small courtyard. Half the wall had collapsed. Weeds grew from the cracks in the stone, some taller than a man. On the roof of the center room, half the tiles were missing, exposing the dark rafters like a bald patch on a man's head. But the door was brand new. 2 wooden slabs painted in glossy black lacquer. The surface was smooth, without a single scratch. A red string was tied to the handle, dangling a piece of yellow paper with a talisman drawn on it. I stopped at the entrance. I didn't go in. I smelled something. It wasn't rust, and it wasn't the charred scent of burning paper. It was something else. Old dust. It smelled like an incense burner that hadn't been emptied in 20 years. Every inch of the air was thick with invisible powder. One breath made my throat feel dry and gritty. A draft of wind seeped through the crack in the door. As it brushed against the red mark on my brow, the skin underneath suddenly twitched. It felt like someone had pressed a needle against my flesh. I instinctively reached up to cover it. The moment my hand moved, the stone bowl in my shirt vibrated. It wasn't a hum, it was a jolt. The milky white bead at the bottom of the bowl slammed against the side. Thud. I heard it clearly through my clothes. The white thread inside the bead, which usually drifted lazily, had curled into a tight ball. It huddled against the black silk thread as if it were protecting it, or perhaps hiding from something. I took 1 step back. Then 2. I retreated behind a patch of tall weeds near the gate and crouched down. I watched the black doors through the gaps in the leaves. The door opened. No one walked out. It opened on its own, creaking outward from the inside. Then it stopped, half open. The interior was pitch black. It wasn't the kind of darkness you see during the day. It looked like a vertical well of shadows. I stayed still. My heart dropped from my throat back into my chest, but my hands and feet were ice cold. I counted my breaths. On the 7th breath, someone stepped out. He wore a gray Taoist robe. He was tall and thin. He dragged his left foot. It was Xianqing, but something was wrong. His stride was different from the one I'd seen in the bamboo forest. It was slower, stiffer. It looked like someone was pushing him from behind. He stopped at the threshold. Then, he slowly turned his head toward the weeds where I was hiding. The corners of his mouth curled up. He smiled. I pressed my back against the ground, shrinking back. The faint gold rings were still in his eyes, but a tiny black that had appeared in the center of his pupils, the size of a needle point. He was staring right at me. 3 months, Xianqing said. His voice was just as raspy as before, but he dragged out the final syllable. It sounded like someone speaking through a layer of water. Then the door shut. Creak. It slammed closed. The impact shook the red string on the handle. The yellow talisman flipped over, revealing the cinnabar drawing on the back. It was a drawing of a person. Their limbs were splayed out, suspended in midair by several thin lines. I stood up from the weeds and turned to leave. I walked fast, but I didn't run. I forced myself not to. Running would leave a scent trail. I had smelled it in the forest, that sour sweat mixed with rust. That smell had seeped out of the doorway and hadn't dissipated. It hung over the courtyard like a layer of invisible sand. I made it out of the hollow. By the time I reached the crooked walnut tree, the sun had set. The western clouds were burning red. The tree's shadow stretched long across the ground. A gust of wind caught the paper ash between the 3 stones, swirling it up into my face. I wiped my eyes. The ash was cold, dead cold. By the time I returned to the Earth God Temple, it was pitch black. I didn't light a lamp. I entered in the dark, bolted the door from the inside, and slid down to sit on the floor. The stone bowl against my chest was cold now. Completely cold. The stone bowl was cold against my chest, like a rock pulled from the bottom of a deep well. I pulled it out and looked at it by the moonlight. Inside the bead at the bottom of the bowl, the white thread was still shriveled up. The black thread, however, was motionless. It lay across the center of the bead like a frozen iron bar. I poked the bead with my finger. The surface was rock hard, losing that slight softness I had felt earlier that morning. "You're scared?" I whispered to the bowl. The bowl didn't react. I sighed and set it on the offering table, then crawled into the pile of hay underneath. Looking up, I could see half a grasshopper caught in a spiderweb on the rafters. Its legs were tangled in silk, dangling and swaying in the dark. I closed my eyes, but my mind was a mess. I kept seeing those black lacquered doors. I smelled that gray, dusty scent seeping through the cracks. I saw the way Xian Qing's mouth curled when he turned his head, and that needlepoint black dot in his pupils. 3 months. I had done the math on the walk back from the hollow. Starting from today, I had exactly 91 days. 91. I rolled over to face the wall. A centipede crawled out of a crack, reddish-brown and about an inch long. It moved slowly past my face and disappeared into the bricks behind the table leg. I reached for the dagger at my waist. It was still there. I gripped the hilt, rolled back over, and laid the blade across my chest. Moonlight spilled through the broken window, silvering the edges of the stone bowl. The cracks in the bottom looked incredibly deep in the pale light, like riverbeds that had been dry for centuries. I stared at the main crack for a long time. Then I saw it move. It was slow, agonizingly slow, like a sleeping snake shifting its weight. The widest part of the crack suddenly narrowed, then expanded again. It looked like it was breathing. I sat up and leaned in close. The crack was definitely moving. It had a slow, rhythmic pulse, and it matched my own breathing perfectly. I took a deep breath. The crack opened. I exhaled. The crack closed. A sudden realization hit me. The bowl was mimicking me. Or rather, it was breathing with me. Ever since the night I fused that speck of light into my brow, since the moment my heartbeat linked with this stone bowl, it had been becoming a part of my body. Every crack in the bowl corresponded to a fracture in my own divinity. The bowl was breathing, which meant my power was breathing too. I touched the red mark on my forehead. The scab had thinned again. The flesh underneath was deep red and raw, pulsing like a new set of fish gills. "You're growing," I said. I wasn't sure if I was talking to the bowl or to myself. I lay back down with the dagger on my chest, hilt up. Just before I closed my eyes, I heard a dull thud outside the door. My eyes snapped open. Something had brushed against the door. It wasn't heavy. It sounded like a leaf blown by the wind. I waited, but there was no other sound. I closed my eyes again, but my ears stayed sharp. A hunter's ears are trained by a decade of sleeping in the deep mountains. I listened to the wind, the distant barking of dogs in the town, and the synchronized rhythm of my heart and the bowl. I eventually fell into a shallow, gray sleep. I dreamed of a gray courtyard, gray doors, and gray weeds. In the dream, a man held a gray silk thread. Something dark was tied to the end of it, dragging behind him on the ground. It carved a deep trench in the earth, and the water seeping into the trench was blood red. The man turned to look at me. His mouth pulled back into a grin, revealing rows of rotting, black teeth. I bolted awake. It was dawn. A thin, even layer of dust had settled on the offering table overnight. The stone bowl sat in the middle of it, but the rim of the bowl was perfectly clean, without a single speck of gray. Inside the bead, the white thread had uncurled. It wasn't hiding anymore. It swam to the center and began to circle the black thread, over and over, as if it were drawing something. As I climbed out from under the table, I heard footsteps outside. They were light, stepping cautiously onto the dirt in front of the temple. I pushed the door open. In the morning light, an old woman stood there. She held 3 sticks of incense in her trembling hands. Her hair was stark white, her back was deeply hunched, and her eyes were red as if she hadn't slept at all. She froze when she saw me. Her lips quivered, but no sound came out. She simply lifted the incense toward me. I stepped aside to let her see the offering table. She walked in unsteadily and planted the incense in the ceramic jar. Then, she knelt and knocked her head against the floor 3 times. The sound of her forehead hitting the ground was a dull, heavy thud. "Xiao Bao." Her voice was a ragged whisper. "Grandma came to see you." I leaned against the doorframe, watching the incense burn. The scent of sandalwood drifted through the air, masking the damp, fishy smell of the temple mud. The red mark on my brow flared with heat again. This time, it didn't hurt. It felt warm, like someone had breathed gently on my skin. When the incense was halfway burned, I heard a voice. It was tiny, coming from the direction of the offering table. It had a sound I had never heard before, like the very first crack of ice melting in spring. "Grandma, I'm okay now." The old woman's sob broke. She tried to keep it in her throat, but her shoulders shook like leaves in a gale. She stayed there, head buried in her hands, her back arching with every breath. I turned and walked out. The sun was rising, reflecting off the dew on the stone path at the edge of town. To the north, the crown of that crooked walnut tree peeked over the hollow like a finger pointing at the sky. I touched the mark on my brow. The scab was gone. In its place was a thin, pink line. It wasn't swollen or red. It sat flat against my skin like a fresh, tender root. I glanced back into the temple. The old woman was still kneeling, but her posture had softened. Her shoulders were relaxed, her hands were pressed together, and her lips were moving in a silent prayer. The incense burned down to nothing, the ash falling into the jar. The smoke vanished, leaving only a faint sweetness in the air. I pulled the temple door shut and walked back into town. As I passed the general store, the owner's wife called out to me. "Xiaoyi, that gash on your head finally healed up?" "It's healed," I replied. "Doesn't look like a scar," she said, squinting at me. "Looks more like a tattoo. That pink color is actually quite nice." I touched my forehead. When my fingertip hit that thin line, a word popped into my head: root. When I was lying under the table, the bowl's breathing had matched mine. When the white thread circled the black one, it looked like a root testing the soil for a direction to grow. I looked down at my palm. The cut on my thumb had scabbed over, but there was a new line in the center of my palm. It was a very fine crease starting from the base of my ring finger, heading toward my wrist. It stopped halfway, like a sprout that hadn't found its way yet. I squeezed my fist. The new line felt warm. I looked north toward the walnut tree. It stood motionless over the hollow. 3 months, I whispered. I started walking north. I was going back to that courtyard. I was going to crouch there all day if I had to. I needed to see how many times those black doors opened, how long they stayed open, and which way the wind blew when they did. I wondered if there was something else hidden in the ash I'd blown away. When a hunter stalks his prey, he doesn't always need a bow or a blade. Sometimes, he just needs his eyes and his nose. I looked at the stone bowl in my bag. Inside the bead at the bottom, that white thread had formed a small, tight loop. It circled the black thread perfectly, like a fence that hadn't quite taken full control yet. He was raising 7 of them. I reached the mountain hollow before the first light of dawn broke the horizon. I avoided the gravel path, circling in from the side of the slope instead. The dew on the tall grass soaked through my pants, and wet mud clung to my boots, making the rocks slick. I found a spot about 30 yards from the Taoist temple, crouching low behind a thick patch of shrubs. The leaves were dense. I nudged them aside just enough to see those 2 black lacquered doors. As the sky turned a pale, misty gray, the doors creaked open. This time, they didn't move on their own. Xianxing pushed them open and stepped out. He was clutching that same cloth bag. He stood on the threshold and stretched, his spine popping with 2 sharp cracks. He shut the gates and started walking down the mountain path toward the walnut tree. I didn't move. I stayed pinned to the dirt, watching his silhouette disappear. I started counting. 1, 2, 3. I didn't stop until I reached 183. Only then did I crawl out of the bushes and circle to the back of the temple wall. There was a gap at the base where the wall had partially collapsed. I stayed low and peered through the hole. The weeds in the courtyard had grown even taller since yesterday. Fine, dark gray silk threads were stretched between the stalks. They were identical to the one I'd seen on Xianxing's finger, shimmering like an unfinished spiderweb. In the center of the yard, a circle had been carved into the dirt. It was about 3 feet wide. The bottom of the trench blackened as if it had been scorched by fire. A single bamboo stake stood in the dead center, a strip of gray cloth fluttering from the top. I waited for the duration of a single incense stick, making sure the place was truly empty. Then, I vaulted over the wall. I landed on the balls of my feet, toes turned inward to dampen the sound. It was a technique I'd practiced 1,000 times in the hunting grounds. One wrong step could spook a deer from a mile away. I crouched by the circle. The black substance in the trench wasn't ash. It was solid, like a layer of dried lacquer. I poked it with the tip of my dagger, but it wouldn't break. It was harder than the surrounding earth. I reached out and touched the soil at the base of the bamboo stake. It was damp and it was hot. I leaned in and sniffed. The smell of old incense ash was there, but beneath it was something else. A cloying, sweet scent. It smelled like sugar that had been boiled until it turned into a bitter, charred mess. I stood up and moved through the weeds toward the 3 stone houses. The doors were bolted shut. The windows were sealed with yellow paper covered in complex red talismans. I walked to the back wall of the house on the far right. Near the foundation, I found a row of small holes, each about the width of a finger. They were perfectly spaced. I slid my dagger into one of the holes. The blade hit something soft. When I pulled it out, the tip was coated in a translucent, sticky slime. It had no smell, but a memory flashed in my mind. I saw the gray lines floating in the water vats at Liu Family Cove. I saw the black sediment at the bottom of the bowls. This was the same thing. I didn't stay long. I climbed back over the wall and headed north. Xianqing had gone toward the walnut tree, but I'd studied his gait yesterday. His left leg dragged. Every mile he walked, that drag became more pronounced as his old injury flared up. The walk to the town entrance was short, so the drag should have been light. But this morning, the sound of his left foot hitting the ground was heavy. He was going much further than the tree. I followed the northern trail. The path grew narrower and narrower until it became a mere slit between two towering rock faces. Moss covered the stone walls, making the passage incredibly slippery. I pressed my back against the rock and shuffled through, my boots squeaking against the stone. The crevice opened into a small, hidden hollow surrounded by mountains on three sides. In the center stood an ancient elm tree, its trunk so thick it would take 2 men to reach around it. Xianqing was sitting beneath it. But he wasn't alone. 7 bowls were arranged in a circle on the ground in front of him. Each one was filled with a grayish-white powder. A single stick of incense was planted in each bowl. The sticks weren't lit, but the tips were black and charred. Xianqing sat cross-legged in the center of the circle, hands resting on his knees and eyes closed. I pulled back into the shadows of the rock slit, slowing my breathing until it was silent. His lips were moving. He wasn't chanting a spell. He was talking to someone. His voice was a low murmur, but a few words drifted over to me. Follow, grow longer, faster. He stopped talking and opened his eyes. He dipped a finger into the powder of the first bowl and tasted it. He did the same for the second, third, and fourth. When he reached the 5th bowl, he frowned. He wiped his finger on his sleeve and pulled a small vial from his robes. He dripped a few drops of a dark liquid into the powder. A thin wisp of gray smoke rose from the bowl. It swirled in the air, forming the distinct shape of a human hand with its fingers spread wide. Xianqing watched the smoke for a moment, then reached out and flicked it. The powder in the bowl turned a shade darker, almost black. A chill crawled up my spine, colder than the damp stone at my back. 7 bowls. I counted them 3 times to be sure. 7 families had fled Liu Family Cove. Everything started to click. The copper bell fueled by 3 years of guilt. The gray lines in the water vats. The heated soil under the stake. The holes in the temple wall. And now, these 7 bowls. He was harvesting them. He was raising 7 spirits at once. If you counted the one inside Boss Zhao's bell, he had been at this for nearly 8 years. I suppressed my breath and began to back away, inch by inch. Once I was clear of the crevice, I turned and hurried back toward the main path, my footsteps lighter than air. As I neared the trail, a sharp sound echoed from the hollow behind me. Ding! It sounded exactly like a copper bell. Then came Xianqing's voice, much louder this time. It ran. 1 got away. There are only 6 left. I didn't wait to hear more. I sprinted. By the time I reached the walnut tree, the sun was high in the sky. I knelt by the 3 stones and pushed aside the pile of burnt paper ash. Buried beneath the gray soot was a small bundle wrapped in white cloth. There were dark red stains on the fabric, forming jagged characters. I unwrapped it. Inside was a single tuft of human hair. The child's hair was thin and soft. It was a sickly yellowish color, the kind you only see on someone who hasn't eaten a real meal in a long time. I wrapped it back up and buried it exactly where I found it. My knees popped loudly as I stood. I had to stretch my legs to get the blood flowing again. Between the crouching and the walking, my muscles felt like iron bands. As I headed back toward the town, a voice echoed in my mind. It wasn't someone else speaking. It was my own voice, clear and cold. I had never heard my inner thoughts with such sharp clarity before. 6 bowls. 6 families. He was raising them like livestock. He was waiting for them to ripen so he could harvest them for his pills. I stopped walking and looked down at my palm. The new mark had grown since yesterday. It stretched from the base of my ring finger toward my wrist, a thin, reddish trail about half an inch long. When I clenched my fist, the mark pulsed with heat. It felt like an invisible thread was pulling me toward the north, toward the mountain gully. Suddenly, I could feel the bowls. The sensation was blurry, like sensing the sun through closed eyelids, but it was there. 6 points of light. 5 were bright, but 1 was dim, the one Xianqing had tasted and ruined with that black water. The further I walked toward the town, the more the feeling faded. Once I passed the town entrance, the heat in my palm died down, leaving only a faint twitching under the skin. I went straight back to the Earth God Temple. I bolted the door behind me and pulled a broken clay jar from beneath the offering table. It was the one I used for incense ash. I dumped the gray soot onto the floor and used my knife to carve 7 marks into the bottom of the jar. 6 long lines, 1 short. I tucked the jar into a corner and pulled out the stone bowl. Inside the pearl at the bottom of the bowl, the white line was still circling the black thread. It was thicker than yesterday. It was moving faster, too. The black thread remained coiled in a tight, motionless ball. "You're feeding on it," I whispered to the pearl. The white line didn't answer, but its speed increased just a fraction. It reminded me of a small fish sensing bait in the water. I set the bowl on the table and sat on the floor, staring into the shadows. My mind kept returning to one thing: the 3 months Xianqing had promised me. Was he really giving me 3 months, or would he come for me the moment I became useful? He had mentioned a spirit ran away today. Was that the one I had absorbed into my own soul? If Xianqing lost a source of power, he would need a replacement. In his eyes, I was just a vessel waiting to be emptied. I squeezed my fist. The mark on my palm jumped. I couldn't just sit here and wait for him to come for me. I left the temple before dark. I took my knife, the stone bowl, and 3 sticks of incense. This time, I avoided the main northern path. I circled around the eastern edge of the town and climbed a low ridge. I stayed on the high ground, moving along the spine of the hill so I could look down into the hollow from above. At dusk, I lay flat in the tall grass and peered over the edge. The old elm tree in the hollow swayed in the evening wind. The 7 bowls were still there, but something new stood beside them. It was a straw effigy, about 3 feet tall, with roughly shaped arms and legs. A bamboo skewer was driven into its head, wrapped in a strip of gray cloth. A yellow paper talisman was pinned to its chest. The cinnabar ink on the paper glowed a dull, bruised red in the fading light. Xianqing was nowhere to be seen. The hollow was empty, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like a dining room where the guests had been told to stand and wait. I stayed on that ridge until the sun vanished. Darkness swallowed the gully, but the 7 bowls began to glow with a pale, grayish light. They looked like shards of the moon scattered on the dirt. The talisman on the straw man pulsed in the dark, its red light flickering in time with the wind. I waited until the moon was high before I moved. I slid down the ridge and approached from the side, keeping the thick trunk of the elm tree between me and the effigy. I stopped about 15 feet away. A heavy, sweet, burnt smell hit me. It was the same scent I had found under the stake in the Taoist courtyard. I crouched behind the tree and pulled out the stone bowl. The white line inside the pearl stopped circling. It went rigid, pointing straight at the talisman on the straw man's chest. The black thread twitched like a nervous tentacle. I set the bowl on the ground and lit my 3 sticks of incense. The smoke didn't rise into the air. Instead, it spread out, crawling across the dirt toward the 7 bowls. Each wisp of smoke dove into a bowl, swirling the gray powder into a thin mist. Suddenly, 7 figures appeared in my mind. They were blurry and hunched over, like beggars waiting for a bowl of hot porridge. I saw the feet of one figure. He was barefoot, and a thin gray thread was tied around his ankle. The other end of the thread was looped around the straw man's wrist. I stood up and drew my knife. I walked forward, step by step, until I was standing over the effigy. I knelt and pressed the blade against the edge of the yellow paper. I flicked the tip, catching the corner of the talisman. The cinnabar flashed under the moonlight. I held my breath and sliced upward. There was a faint sound, like silk tearing. The red light on the straw man's chest died instantly. At the same moment, the powder in the 7 bowls sank. It turned from a ghostly white to a dull, earthy yellow, looking like wet ash. I folded the torn talisman and shoved it into my robe. I picked up my stone bowl. The incense had finished burning, but the white line in the pearl was spinning frantically, faster than I had ever seen. A faint golden light radiated from the pearl, casting a glow against the inner walls of the bowl. Then I heard it. A voice. It was weak, like 7 people shouting at once through a heavy quilt. Who? Who is it? I looked at the 7 bowls, then at the straw man. I sheathed my knife. I'm a hunter, I whispered to the empty gully. I'm here to untie the ropes. I turned and walked away. By the time I cleared the hollow, the moon was at its peak, lighting the stony path with a cold, white glare. I walked back toward the town, stepping on my own shadow. It stretched out long in front of me, like an arm reaching into the dark. The talisman in my pocket pressed against my thigh, growing warmer by the second. The mark on my palm surged again. It shot another half-inch toward my wrist and doubled in thickness. It was scalding hot. I kept my fist clenched the entire way home. It was late when I reached the Earth God Temple. I didn't light a lamp. I sat in the dark under the offering table, my back against the cold bricks. I pulled the talisman out and spread it across my knees. One corner was damp with my sweat, and the cinnabar ink had begun to bleed, spreading across the yellow paper like a drop of blood in water. I flattened the paper with my finger, using the thin sliver of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the window to see it clearly. The patterns were a mess. It looked like someone had closed their eyes and just drawn circles within circles, ending in a dark, tangled blotch in the very center. I couldn't make sense of it. But when I flipped the talisman over, I saw 4 tiny characters written in the corner. They were no bigger than grains of rice. Soul locking for concealment. I stared at those words for a long time. Concealment? What was he hiding? Xianqing had been chanting in that hollow, losing 1 spirit while 6 remained. I had torn the paper and let those 6 go. Now, Xianqing had nothing left. I thought about the shattered bell in Boss Zhao's inn. I thought about the empty hole under the locust tree at Li the Lame's house. Finally, I thought about the glowing speck of light embedded in my own brow. 8 sources of nourishment. Xianqing had spent 8 years cultivating them, and in a single night, I had set more than half of them free. I folded the paper and set it on the offering table. I touched the red mark on my forehead. The pink line was even fainter than yesterday, fading into the color of my skin. If I didn't look closely, it was almost invisible, but I could feel a slight ridge under my touch. It felt like a thin, taut tendon buried beneath the flesh. I pulled out the broken clay jar I'd used to track my progress. I used my knife to scrape away the 6 short marks I'd made earlier, leaving only the 1 long scratch at the bottom. I stared at it for a second, then carved a new, shorter mark right next to it. 1 long, 1 short. Side by side. That short one was me. As I moved to put the jar back, my fingertip brushed the talisman. The moonlight hit the paper at a sharp angle, revealing something new. A scratch I'd made with my knife earlier was glowing, a thin white line snaking through the red cinnabar ink. It looked exactly like the white line inside the pearl in my stone bowl. I pulled the bowl out. The white line inside the pearl was still spinning around the black thread, though slower than before. However, the circle it traced had grown wider, expanding like the roots of a tree pushing through soil. I touched the pearl. It was warm, exactly the same temperature as the mark on my palm. I pressed the talisman against the bottom of the bowl. The moment the paper touched the stone, a wisp of thin white smoke seeped out from the crack in the bowl's base. The smoke coiled around the paper, burrowing into it inch by inch. As the smoke touched the cinnabar patterns, the red began to bleed out, fading to dark red, then gray, and finally a dull, earthy yellow. Even the 4 tiny characters vanished, looking like ink that had been soaked in water for days. When the last of the smoke disappeared, the talisman snapped in half. The tear was perfectly straight, as if cut by a razor. The 2 pieces began to curl upward on the table, shriveling into 2 small, dry cocoons. I picked them up. They were burning hot, matching the pulsing heat in my palm. After a few heartbeats, the heat vanished. The paper rolls turned ice cold and went limp, feeling like wet leaves against my skin. I opened my hand. The paper didn't just sit there, it melted. It didn't burn away, it dissolved like snowflakes on a warm stone, turning transparent before soaking directly into the new line on my palm. The mark absorbed the pulp and darkened instantly, turning from a faint pink to a deep, bruised red. It looked like a vein gorged with blood. Then, my vision shifted. Everything turned gray and hazy, like I was looking through a thick fog. I blinked several times until the mist cleared, and that's when I saw it. A thin, pale golden thread of light was stretching out from the offering table. It pierced straight through the wall of the temple and headed north. I stood up and followed the light with my eyes. It didn't break when it hit the bricks. Instead, the walls became semi-transparent where the light passed through. I could see the rooftops of the town and the jagged silhouette of the mountain ridge in the distance. The golden line stretched all the way to the gully in the north, ending at the Taoist temple. It settled there as a tiny, unmoving gold. "That's where Xianxing is," I whispered. I looked down at my palm. The dark red line was twitching. Every time it pulsed, the gold dot in the distance flickered and sank. It was a tether. One end was tied to my hand, the other was tied to him. I tried clenching my fist. The line snapped shut, and the gold vanished as the gray fog rolled back over my eyes. I opened my hand, and the connection returned. I sat by the table for a long time, stunned. My hunter's instinct told me this was useful, but incredibly dangerous. I could see exactly where Xianxing was, but there was no guarantee he couldn't feel the other end of that string. I was using his own talisman to track him. It was like a hunter taking a trophy from a beast and hanging it around his neck. The beast might just hear the bell ringing. But I needed that bell. I tucked the stone bowl back into my robe and stepped out into the night. The moonlight was so bright it looked like water spilled across the ground. The town was silent. Even the dogs were asleep. I followed the golden line, passing the old locust tree at the edge of town and stepping onto the dirt path leading north. The mark in my palm kept pulsing. With every step I took, the gold dot became clearer. I could feel it moving now, pacing back and forth between the temple and the hollow, like a caged animal. I reached the crooked walnut tree and stopped. Someone was there, and Xianxing was crouching by 3 large stones, his hands sifting through a pile of paper ash. His eyes were terrifying in the moonlight. Those golden rings in his pupils had fully emerged, 2 circles overlapping, gold on the outside, black on the inside, like a pair of iron shackles. He heard my footsteps and looked up. When he saw me, his lips curled into a slow, jagged grin. "You touched my things," he said. I stopped about 20 feet away. I didn't draw my knife, but my thumb was hooked over the hilt, ready to flick it open. "The things you were raising shouldn't have been kept," I replied. Xianxing stood up. As he rose, I saw what he was clutching in his left hand. It was one of the 7 bowls from the hollow. There was still a thin layer of yellowish powder at the bottom, identical to the color the talisman had turned before it dissolved. He held the bowl up, the crack in its side gleaming under the moon. "This was the 6th one," Xianxing said, his voice as flat as stagnant water. "I raised them for 3 years and 2 months. I was 2 months away from the harvest. You tore a piece of paper and ruined it all." As he spoke, the gray silk thread snapped out from his index finger, hovering in the air with a faint vibration. But I noticed something. His left hand, the one holding the bowl, was shaking violently. His knuckles were white. It wasn't just anger. He looked drained. Losing those 7 nutrients had cost him something internal. I took half a step back, my thumb clicking the knife hilt up just an inch. "You locked them up for 3 years," I said. "You knew what you were doing." Xianxing let out a short, sharp laugh. The sound echoed off the trunk of the walnut tree, bouncing back so it sounded like 2 people laughing at once. "I knew," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "But do you know why I locked them? Not one of them didn't come to me of their own accord. Every single one of them. Every single one of them begged me to save their lives," Xianxing sneered. "Old Zhao came to my door himself to buy that bell. He begged for it. Then, once he had what he wanted, he regretted the price. Human nature? I've seen far more of it than you ever will." He slammed the bowl in his hand onto the ground. It shattered into 3 jagged pieces. A cloud of yellowish powder billowed up, scattering in the moonlight like a layer of frost. "You tore a talisman and saved 6 people," he continued, his voice dripping with venom. "Do you really think they'll be grateful?" I didn't answer. Suddenly, a spark ignited in my mind. The lines on my palm throbbed. The sensation wasn't pulling me north anymore. It was pulling me south, toward the town. Someone there was whispering my name. I closed my eyes. I could hear Lee the Lame's voice drifting from the direction of the town, clear as a dream. I wonder if little Yi has eaten yet, he murmured. Then came a second voice, Fatty Wong. Save a good bowl of food for that kid tomorrow. Stop giving him that coarse tea. A third followed, the lady from the general store. I wonder if that scar on his brow has healed yet. The voices layered over each other, surging toward me like warm spring water bubbling up from the earth. I opened my eyes. Xianqing stood before me, his gray thread extended to its limit, thin as a spider's silk under the moon. But the smirk on his face faltered. He stared at the space between my eyebrows. The double rings in his pupils constricted violently. You, he breathed. The red mark on my brow was glowing. It wasn't reflected moonlight. The light was bleeding out from beneath my skin. It was a faint, shimmering gold. I could see the glow on my own eyelids. My palm burned as if I were clutching a hot coal. A line of fire raced from my wrist to my fingertips, crawling under my flesh. I drew my knife. At the exact moment the blade cleared the sheath, I heard a crisp crack from the bead hidden in my clothes. It didn't shatter, but a single fissure opened across its surface. A white thread lunged out from the crack, coiling around Xianqing's black silk. The white line tightened. It strangled the black thread, thinning it out until the darkness faded entirely, merging into the white. The bead against my chest transformed from milky white to a pale, translucent gold. Its internal patterns vanished, leaving it smooth and round like a polished river stone. Xianqing flicked his finger, sending the gray thread snapping toward me. I didn't dodge. I swung my knife in a horizontal arc. The blade met the thread. I felt zero resistance. The thread snapped in two. One half recoiled back to Xianqing's finger. The other drifted through the air like a wisp of extinguished smoke before settling into the dirt. Xianqing stared at his index finger. A tiny cut had appeared on the tip, oozing a thin line of blood. He looked up at me. The rings in his eyes spun a full turn and a half, then dissolved. The gold faded. The black receded. His eyes returned to being ordinary, tired, and old. You've merged with it, Xianqing said. His voice wasn't raspy anymore. It was dry and hollow, like a man who hadn't tasted water in days. I sheathed my knife. The golden light on my brow went dark. The heat in my palm ebbed away, but the dark red line didn't disappear. It was embedded in my skin now, fused permanently with my own pulse. The 8 lives you were raising, I said. I've set them all free. Xianqing stood under the walnut tree. The moonlight stretched his thin shadow across the ground like a snapped bamboo pole. He looked at his bleeding finger, then slowly raised his head. The muscles in his face seemed to collapse, sagging until the sharp contours of his skull were visible. I won't kill you, he said, but I will remember you. He turned and began walking toward the northern ravine. His steps were heavy. Every time his left foot hit the ground, it left a shallow pit in the dirt. I watched his silhouette disappear into the night. I waited until I was sure the broken gray thread had crumbled into dust and blown away before I turned back toward the town. By the time I reached the entrance of the village, the horizon was turning pale. A stray cat sat on the roots of the old locust tree, licking its paws. It let out a soft meow and vanished over a wall. I stood under the tree for a moment, touching a patch of freshly turned earth. It was cold, but I felt something moving deep beneath, a tiny, rhythmic stir, like a seed turning over in its sleep. I walked toward the Earth God Temple. As I passed Lee the Lame's house, his gate creaked open. Lee poked his head out, draped in a coat. He smiled when he saw me. Just in time, he said. The porridge is fresh. Come in and have a bowl. Standing at his door, my nose suddenly stung. I looked down, wiped my eyes with my sleeve, and stepped over the threshold with a smile. I'll take one. The fire was crackling in Lee's hearth. The porridge bubbled in the pot. I sat by the stove, holding a hot bowl and taking slow, deliberate bites. It was cooked soft, filled with red dates and peanuts. The bead in my pocket caught the reflection of the fire, glowing a pale gold. The crack on its surface looked different now, curved at both ends, like a crescent moon smile. I finished the meal and set the empty bowl on the stove. Aren't you going to rest a while? Lee called out. I've rested enough, I replied. The sun was just cresting the horizon as I stepped back outside. It cast long shadows from the old locust tree. I looked north. The ravine was shrouded in mist, the crown of that crooked walnut tree flickering in and out of sight. My palm had stopped throbbing, but the golden speck to the north was still there. It was dimmer now, like a lamp running out of oil, but it was still burning. Xian Qing had said he'd come to collect his debt in 3 months. But after I used my own talisman to snap his thread and release his nutrients, I had a feeling that debt was going to be called in much sooner. I clenched my fist. The dark red line in my palm grew warm. It wasn't painful. It felt like a warm breath against my skin. "I'm not afraid," I whispered. I walked toward the Earth God Temple, my steps steady. I wasn't just the hunter who had crouched by the well 3 days ago. I was something else now. When I reached the temple, 3 items were sitting on the offering table. A string of dried chili peppers hung from the corner. A bowl of white rice mixed with red beans sat next to the jar. Finally, there was a small packet of salt wrapped in coarse paper with the word Zhou written on it. I knelt to look at the salt. Old Zhou the herbalist had messy, jagged handwriting, like someone scratching the earth with a twig. The salt was coarse and smelled of the sea. I picked up the bowl of rice. It was fresh, still holding the scent of the fields. I pinched a few grains and chewed them. They were crunchy and sweet. I hadn't had a real meal in 3 days. My stomach was a void, and the raw rice vanished into it without a sound. I walked back out to the street. Cooking smoke was rising high over the town now, and the sun made the cobblestones gleam white. I saw the lady from the general store setting out vegetables. "Little Yi," she shouted, "did you see the things left at your door this morning?" "I saw them," I said. "Old Zhou put them there before dawn," she whispered, leaning in. "Ever since you helped Li the Lame's family, word has been spreading. Old Zhou said his backyard had been spitting black water for 3 days. Then yesterday morning, it suddenly cleared up. His wife said she dreamed of a hunter," the shopkeeper whispered. "He was crouching by their well, pouring a bowl of water into it. After that, the water turned crystal clear." I tapped my thumb against the hilt of my knife. I hadn't been anywhere near Old Zhou's backyard last night. "That well," I said. "Did something happen there before?" The woman thought for a moment. "Last winter, Old Zhou's little girl was playing by the edge and nearly fell in. After they pulled her out, the child started talking nonsense. She kept saying there was someone singing at the bottom of the well. Old Zhou brought in several masters to look at it, but none of them could figure it out. Eventually, the talk died down, but that well stayed murky. Even after boiling it, the water tasted like swamp mud." I nodded and didn't ask anything else. I turned and headed toward the east end of town. Old Zhou's house sat at the very edge of the village. I walked into the yard and saw the well immediately. It was ringed with green stone, the edges covered in a layer of moss so thick it looked black, like it had been scorched by smoke. Old Zhou was busy drying herbs, arranging them neatly on bamboo trays. He looked up and froze when he saw me. "Little Yi, what are you doing here?" "I came to see your well," I said. Old Zhou dropped his herbs and walked over, the wrinkles on his face deepening. He looked like he wanted to say something, but was holding back. "That well, what did you pour into it last night?" I scratched the back of my head. "I didn't pour anything." "What?" "I woke up in the middle of the night to use the latrine," he said, sounding confused. I heard a splash from the well. When I looked, the water had cleared up halfway. I thought some kind soul had come by to clean it out for me. I walked to the well and crouched down. I touched the moss. It felt cool, but underneath, there was a faint, lingering warmth. It felt as if someone had been pressing their palm against the stone to comfort it. I dipped my hand into the water. It was warm, almost the same temperature as my own skin. I closed my eyes and listened. I didn't use my ears. I used that fading red mark on my brow. Beneath my skin, a tiny root-like fiber vibrated. It felt like a fish poking its head above the surface to catch a breath. I heard it. There was something at the bottom. It was faint, like a shadow dissolving into a bucket of water. It was huddled in the deepest layer of silt, curled up and motionless. It was barely alive, but it was there. Something had been trapped down there for a long time. I stood up. The thing is gone now. There's just a bit of residual energy left. Find a clean stone and cover the well. Lift it in 7 days, and the rest of it will dissipate on its own. Old Zhou stared at me, blinking rapidly. His mouth hung open for a long time before he managed to squeeze out a question. How do you know that? I didn't answer. I brushed the dirt off my hands and walked away. At the gate, I paused and glanced back. The well water was slowly brightening, layer by layer, like ice rising from the depths. When I got back to the Earth God Temple, more offerings had appeared at the door. A bag of red dates, a bundle of dried mugwort, a half-gourd of wine. I carried them inside one by one and set them on the altar. I sat down and pulled out the stone bowl. The bead at the bottom had changed again. The pale gold had deepened into a rich, burnished orange, like the glow of a setting sun on bronze. The surface was smooth, but that crescent-shaped crack remained, its ends tilted up like a smirk. As I stared at it, I realized something was moving inside the bead. I held the bowl up to the light filtering through the door. Right in the center, there was a speck of dust. It was incredibly small, thinner than a needlepoint, and grayish-white. It floated in the gold, drifting up and down with an invisible current. I touched the surface of the bead. The moment my fingertip made contact, images flashed through my mind. I saw old Joe's backyard. A 5-year-old girl was crouching by the well, tossing pebbles into the dark. As the stones hit the water, the black depths churned violently, like something was swimming up from the bottom. The vision went dark. When it flickered back, the girl was being carried away, her face wet with tears. In that instant, the well water turned twice as murky as before. It never cleared. The vision snapped. I pulled my finger back. The gray speck was still floating, but it looked slightly larger now, about the size of a sesame seed. You're eating again, I whispered. The speck didn't answer, but as it drifted, the edges of the crescent crack on the bead's surface shimmered. It looked like a mouth cracking open just a tiny bit. I tucked the bowl away and stood up. I had a few things to do. First, I needed to find out more about that Taoist, Xianqing. I needed to know which mountain he came from, and if anyone in town knew where he was staying. Second, I needed 3 months to let the thing inside me grow stronger. Third, before I could finish the thought, the door burst open. It was Fatty Wong, the tea house owner. His massive face was squeezed into the doorway, dripping with sweat and gasping for air. Little Yi, you have to come see. Lou's family, they're all back. I stood up. What? 7 families. They all came back this morning, he panted. It's like they just woke up from a dream. They're dragging their luggage home with blank looks on their faces. People asked where they went, but they can't explain it. They just keep saying it's time to go home, over and over. Fatty Wong wiped his brow. But the weirdest part? All of them say they're coming here to burn incense for you. They found the way perfectly, like someone was guiding them the whole time. I pushed past him and stepped outside. Under the old locust tree at the town entrance, groups of people were walking toward the temple. 2 men led the way, followed by women holding children, and an elderly couple leaning on each other at the back. Their expressions were hard to describe. They weren't happy, exactly, but they weren't dazed either. They looked like people who had just woken up from a very long sleep. They remembered everything, but they didn't have the words to say it. The man in the lead stopped in front of the temple and looked at me. His lips trembled. Finally, he spoke. It was you. You saved us. I looked into his eyes. He used to have a faint black ring around his pupils, just like the Taoist Xianqing. Now it was gone. His eyes were a normal deep brown, though they were bloodshot from exhaustion. Come in and light some incense, I said, stepping aside. The 7 families filed into the small temple one by one. They knelt before the altar where the dried peppers, the white rice, the salt, the dates, and the wine sat in a messy pile. A woman pulled a bundle of incense from her robe and handed it to me. I lit the sticks and passed them out. 7 plumes of smoke rose into the air, swirling under the low rafters in a thick cloud that refused to drift away. As the ash fell, every grain seemed to pause in midair for a split second before settling onto the table. They formed a precise pattern, 7 small dots surrounding one large point in the center. It looked like a star. The stone bowl in my shirt grew warm. It started the moment the first person knelt, and by the time the 7th person stood up, it felt like a bundle of hot coals pressed against my chest. The families didn't leave immediately. They sat by the temple door, some rubbing their eyes, some staring into space, others whispering quietly. The woman holding the child walked up to me. She held the boy out toward me. Please, she said softly. Touch his head. My boy kept talking about someone in his dreams, the woman said, her voice trembling. He said that person had a light in the middle of his brow. When I woke up and saw you, I saw that mark. I reached out and touched the child's head. His hair was soft, his scalp warm. The moment my fingertips brushed his hair, the boy looked up at me. He grinned, showing a row of tiny white teeth. Brother, he whispered. My hand stayed there for a moment. As I pulled back, the lines on my palm grew hot. It wasn't the searing burn from before. This was a gentle, steady warmth, like a stone that had been soaking up the sun all afternoon. I looked down at my hand. Next to the dark red line, a new one had appeared. It incredibly thin, a pale gold thread branching off toward my pinky. The two lines lay side by side, one red, one gold, like two vines just starting to sprout. I clenched my fist. Both lines pulsed with heat, the temperatures intertwining as the sensation crawled up my wrist and disappeared under my sleeve. The village bell chimed in the distance. It was noon. The sun sat directly overhead, shrinking the shadow of the earth god temple into a dark puddle on the ground. The 7 families stood up. They began to trickle back toward Yahello. Before the man in the lead left, he turned back to look at me. His lips moved, but no words came out. He simply gave me a firm nod. I nodded back. Once they were gone, I went back inside the temple and shut the door. I pulled the stone bowl from my shirt and set it on the altar. The speck of gray dust inside the pearl had grown. It had a shape now, 2 tiny leaves with a shallow groove between them. It looked like a bean sprout just breaking through the soil. I stared at the little leaf for a while, then touched my brow. The red mark was almost gone, leaving only a faint pink line beneath the skin like a buried root. But when my finger touched it, I felt a rhythm. It wasn't my heartbeat. It was slower, deeper, like the rings of a tree pushing downward into the earth. I understood then. Every time this pearl tasted incense or felt the weight of someone's gratitude, it grew. And every time the pearl grew, the root in my brow dug deeper into my flesh. It didn't grow through meditation or chanting. It grew through people, through the faint, flickering sparks of the souls who knelt before this altar. I leaned against the table and tucked the bowl back into my robe. It felt warm against my chest, like a small animal curled up and snoring against my skin. Then, there was a knock at the door. Thump, thump, thump. 3 steady, unhurried knocks. I walked over and pulled the door open. A man stood there. He looked to be in his late 50s, wearing a faded blue cotton shirt. His hair was gray and thinning, and his face was deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp and bright. He didn't have incense or offerings. He only held a bamboo staff with a bird carved into the head. Are you Ichin? He asked. I nodded. The man smiled thinly and tapped his staff on the ground. I'm from Nanshan. You released the things Xianqing was raising. His senior brother asked me to bring you a message. My fingers drifted toward the dagger at my waist. The man waved his hand dismissively. Don't be nervous. I'm like you, a rogue cultivator. Xianqing's senior brother, Meng Xian, runs a retreat on Green Wolf Mountain to the north. He raised Xianqing. You just ruined 3 years of Xianqing's hard work. Master Meng sent me to ask you a question. He paused, his eyes locking onto mine. Do you want to pay him back? Or do you want to die? Sunlight flooded through the door, painting the temple floor gold. I stood in that light, hand gripping my hilt, staring at the smiling old man. I clenched my jaw until it ached. Tell him to come and ask me himself, I said. The old man laughed and shook his head. He used his bamboo staff to draw a circle in the dirt. Inside the circle was a patch of ash, and buried in that ash was a single black thread, identical to the one Xianqing had used. The temple door remained half open, the sunlight cutting a straight gold line across the dirt floor between us. It was a boundary, one of us on each side. The old man finished the circle, pulled back his staff, and rested his hands on top of it. He looked at me, his face wrinkling like a piece of crumpled paper. You should ask him how to pay, the old man said. Xianqing raised 8 of those things. It took him 8 years. You let 6 go, you smashed 1, and you consumed the last one yourself. 8 total, not a single one left. I didn't answer. I looked at the circle on the ground. It wasn't deep, just a shallow groove, but the bottom of the trench was black, as if it had been charred. The black thread in the center was twice as thick as the one Xianqing had used, and it shimmered with tiny gray specks in the light. You said Xianqing has a senior brother, I said slowly. Green Wolf Mountain, how far is that? The old man pointed his staff north. Cross this ridge and walk for 2 days. It's not a high mountain, but there's an old pine tree at the summit. Under that tree is a house with green roof tiles. That's where Master Meng lives. How old is he? Older than you, the old man chuckled. Why ask, planning on paying him a visit? I let go of my dagger and stepped back toward the altar. I pulled an unlit stick of incense from a jar and tucked it into the corner of my mouth. I'm not going there, I said. But if someone is coming for me, I need to know who they are. The old man narrowed his eyes. A flicker of real interest appeared in his gaze. You've got guts, but guts and a long life are two different things. Master Meng isn't like Xianqing. Xianqing stole those materials from the sect. Master Meng didn't even know about it at first, but now he does. You cost him 8 hidden souls, and he needs to replace them. The fastest way to do that is to use you as the replacement. I kept the incense in my mouth, my mind racing. When a hunter tracks prey, he processes a dozen things at once. Wind direction, hoof prints, the age of the tracks, the moisture in the droppings. My brain was working that same logic now. Meng Xian was a different breed. Xianqing liked to talk, to laugh, to play cat and mouse. But this Meng Xian hadn't even shown his face. He'd sent a messenger. And the messenger was capable of drawing a circle with a black thread at my doorstep. This man was dangerous, yet he spoke like we were just chatting about the weather. Either he was a wolf in sheep's clothing, or he didn't consider me a threat at all. I was just an errand he was running for his brother. What's your name? I asked. Old Huai, the man said. That's what they call me in Nanshan. You can call me Old Huai. Old Huai, I said, taking the incense out of my mouth and tucking it behind my ear. Are you here doing a favor for your junior brother, or are you working for Master Meng? Old Huai's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. It was barely a heartbeat, but I saw it. The wrinkles on his face smoothed out and then snapped back. You kid, Old Huai said, shaking his head. You ask too many questions. Does it matter who I'm working for? It matters, I said. If you're here for your brother, this is personal. If you're here for Master Meng, it's just business. You owe Xianqing a favor, I said, my voice steady. So you're here to deliver a message. Whether I agree or not doesn't matter to you. But if you're working for Master Meng, you can't go back empty-handed. You need a straight answer from me today. Old Huai stopped smiling. He straightened his back, leaning on his bamboo staff, and tilted his chin up. The wrinkles on his face smoothed out, revealing a much more serious expression underneath. Interesting, he muttered. I felt a chill. I'd heard those exact words before. When I first met Xianqing in the bamboo forest, he had said the same thing with the same tone and the same rhythm. Even the way his voice trailed off at the end was identical. You're just like Xianqing, I said. Old Huai didn't deny it. He gripped his staff and took 2 steps toward the temple entrance, stopping just outside the threshold. The sunlight caught his graying hair, making it shimmer. He looked back at me one last time. I won't tell you who I'm working for. You can guess that yourself, he said. But I'll give you a piece of advice. In the next month, nurture that thing inside you. Make it grow. Master Meng will likely be here in 30 days. 1 month, I repeated. Xianqing had told me 3 months. Xianqing wanted to use you as slow-growing bait, Old Huai explained. He thought 1 month was too short for you to ripen. But Master Meng doesn't nurture things. He just takes them apart. A month is enough time for you to let your roots sink deep. If you're rooted firmly enough, tearing you apart becomes a messy job. Maybe then, he'll choose a different target. With that, Old Huai turned south. He walked with a steady, rhythmic pace. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of his bamboo staff hitting the ground was perfectly timed. I watched his back as he walked past the old locust tree at the edge of town, turned onto the mountain path, and disappeared into the pine forest. I closed the temple doors and slid down against the wood until I was sitting on the floor. I pulled the incense stick from behind my ear and shoved it back into my mouth. I started chewing on the bamboo stem. Crunch, crunch. I needed the physical sensation to keep my brain from spiraling. 1 month. That was 60 days less than I thought I had. 60 days is enough for a seedling to sprout 2 inches high, or for a wild rabbit to grow from nursing to foraging. But the seedling inside me, the speck of dust inside the pearl, had only just grown its first 2 leaves. The root at my brow had barely pierced the skin. The lines on my palms were just starting to show. Was 1 month enough? I spat out the chewed-up remains of the first stick and lit a second one. I sifted through the pieces of information old Huai had dropped. Master Ming lived in the Qingma chambers at the mountain peak. Xian Qing had stolen 8 artifacts from his sect. Master Ming didn't grow things, he disassembled them. The picture was becoming clear. Master Ming was on a completely different level than Xian Qing. He didn't play games. He just took what he wanted. I remembered Xian Qing's gray thread. When it snapped, his finger bled, his pupils unraveled, and he looked like a lamp running out of oil. That was the backlash from losing his harvest. If Master Ming was stronger, the backlash would be even more lethal. But even a master needs fuel. What did old Huai mean by disassembling? Was he going to rip the root out of my forehead? Or take my stone bowl? I pulled the bowl out and looked at it. The tiny leaf inside the pearl was slightly larger than it had been this morning. The groove between the 2 halves of the leaf had deepened. It looked like a real bean sprout now. The pearl was still golden, but the color had shifted from a bright orange gold to a deep, weathered bronze, like an antique coin. I flipped the bowl over to check the main crack on the bottom. A faint, golden glow shimmered along the edges. It was self-illuminating in the dim temple. As I leaned closer, I saw something moving within the light, a liquid like mercury, flowing thin and smooth. It traveled to the end of the crack, swirled, and flowed back. I reached out and touched the glow with my fingertip. The moment I made contact, a flood of information crashed into my brain. It was chaotic, like 7 or 8 people screaming in my ear at once. Should I go light a stick of incense for that hunter in the Earth God Temple today? That was the voice of the grocery store owner's wife. The kid lives in that broken temple all alone, came another voice. I wonder if he has enough blankets. That was old Zhou's wife. Tomorrow when we slaughter the pig, save a piece of liver for Lin Yuan, Li the Lame said. That man in the gray clothes didn't come to town today, did he? Asked Fat Wong from the tea house. The voices layered over each other. Fast, slow, high, and low. My head throbbed. I yanked my finger back. The golden glow lingered for a moment before fading back into the stone. I leaned against the door, panting. The influx of thoughts had been too intense, like opening too many windows at once. But I realized something crucial. This bowl allowed me to hear the thoughts of the townspeople when they were thinking about me. I couldn't hear everything, but I could hear the strongest, most frequent emotions directed my way. It meant that the more the townspeople thought of me, cared for me, or relied on me, the more fuel the bowl received. Those thoughts carried a certain warmth. It was the same energy I got from incense, but more natural and constant. I picked up the bowl again. I didn't touch the light this time. I just cradled the bottom. It felt warm in my hand, like a cup of hot tea. Suddenly, the 2 lines on my palm began to heat up, one red, one gold. The heat spread toward my fingers. It faded at the base but intensified at the tips, leaving 5 tiny hot spots on my fingertips. I pressed my fingers against my thigh. Even through the fabric, I felt a strange extension of my senses. It was as if there was an invisible layer over my skin, faint, but definitely there. I looked at my hand. My fingertips were glowing with the same pale gold light as the bowl. I clenched my fist, and the light vanished. I opened it, and it slowly returned. 1 month. I repeated the deadline in my head. In 1 month, the more the town believed in me, the more the bowl would collect. The more the bowl collected, the faster I would grow. It was a cycle. I stood up and cracked the temple door open. The sun was setting. Smoke rose from the chimneys in town. The grocery store lady was closing her stall. From Li the Lame's house, I heard the steady thwack of a cleaver hitting a chopping block. It sounded like a heartbeat. I pushed the door wide and stepped out. I carried the stone bowl in my hand, bottom up. The golden glow was invisible in the evening light, but the bowl stayed warm. It stayed warm all the way down the street. When I reached Li the Lame's house, he was splitting wood. He swung the axe high and brought it down with a sharp crack. He saw me and grinned. Just in time, he said. I saved that pig liver for you. Fresh kill today. I stood at the gate, looking at his wrinkled, smiling face, and then at the old locust tree standing tall in the yard. The dirt under the tree roots was level now. Fresh green grass poked through the cracks, looking vibrant and new. I realized something in that moment. Old Huai had told me that Mr. Ming would come to dismantle me in a month, but he had miscalculated one thing. I wasn't standing here alone. Behind me stood the entire town. I had Li the Lame, Fat Wong, Old Joe, and the grocery store lady. I had the 7 families who had returned. Every one of them carried a shadow of me in their hearts. Every time they thought of me, that shadow grew a little brighter. I had 1 month. I took the half-chewed incense stick out of my mouth and gripped it in my palm. "Call me when the pig liver is stewed," I said to Li. I turned and walked away. The sun sank behind me, turning the horizon into a sea of orange fire. As I walked, I looked down at my own shadow stretching across the blue stone road. Right at the crown of my shadow's head, a tiny spark of light glowed in the twilight. It looked like a freshly lit stick of incense. I woke up before the sun was fully out. I was lying on a pile of straw under the temple's offering table. Old Joe's wife had brought me an old quilt the night before. It was thin and the cotton was worn, but the weight and warmth of it gave me the best sleep I'd had in ages. The first thing I did was reach for the stone bowl in my shirt. It had been pressed against my chest all night. It was warm, the perfect, steady warmth of a body that had been tucked away in a nest. I pulled it out to check the bead at the bottom. The leaf inside had grown again. The 2 halves were spread wide now, the edges curling slightly. I could see the veins clearly, like fine gold wires. It floated in the center of the bead like an autumn leaf trapped in amber. I checked my palms. The lines had grown longer overnight. The golden line had extended half an inch toward my wrist. The red line had branched out, snaking toward the space between my thumb and index finger. The colors were deeper today. It looked like something was silently seeping beneath my skin. I set the bowl on the offering table and pushed the door open. The morning was quiet. Only the roosters were calling, their cries echoing from one end of the town to the other. I walked to the old elm tree in front of the Earth God temple and faced east. As the sun began to hump over the mountain ridge, the faint pink line on my brow twitched. It was a light sensation, like someone plucking a very thin string. I looked toward the sunrise. Gold light flooded half the sky, but through the sensation on my brow, I felt something else hidden in that light. It wasn't the heat of the sun on my skin. It was a deeper, more lingering warmth coming through a different layer of reality. I closed my eyes and focused. The warmth was coming from the southeast. It was far away, but it was there, like a small pile of charcoal burning slowly on the horizon. I opened my eyes and looked. To the southeast lay a range of low mountains with a few scattered villages at the base. The furthest one was several miles away. I could see a thin pillar of smoke rising from it. It looked like ordinary cooking smoke, but to the string on my brow, that smoke was wrapped in gold. Someone was burning incense in that direction. I went back inside, grabbed the stone bowl, and tucked it into my robe. I started walking southeast. I traveled for an hour, crossing 2 mountain ridges, until the village appeared at the foot of a slope. It was a small place, maybe 7 or 8 households huddled together. The houses were even more dilapidated than the ones in my town. The walls were made of stacked stones with yellow mud stuffed into the gaps. A massive tree stood at the entrance, its canopy shading half an acre. A few people were gathered under the tree. As I got closer, I saw the looks on their faces. A young man was crouching with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. An old woman sat on the ground, wailing and beating her chest. A barefoot child stood nearby, sucking on a finger and staring silently at the mountain path. "What happened?" I asked. The young man looked up, his eyes bloodshot. He blinked at me, confused. "Are you just passing through?" "Tell me what's wrong," I said. The old woman grabbed my sleeve. "My husband went up the mountain yesterday to gather herbs. He never came back. I sent people to look for him at dawn, but they couldn't find a trace." I knelt down and looked into her eyes. "Which way did he go?" She pointed toward the northwest. "That way. The old forest. He usually sticks to that area, never goes far. But it got dark and he didn't return. My son went to look last night, but it was too dark to go deep. He went again this morning and found nothing." I stood up and looked toward the northwest. The old forest was about a mile away. It was a dense, tangled mess of trees so thick they blocked out the sky. The pink line on my brow jumped again. This time it was clearer, like a fishing line being tugged from a distance. Wait here, I told the young man. I'll go look. He stood up quickly. I'm coming with you. You won't be able to help, I said. Stay here and wait for him. When he gets back, tell him to go to the temple and burn a stick of incense. I didn't wait for him to argue. I turned and ran toward the forest. My feet felt light, almost like I was skimming over the tops of the grass. Once I entered the woods, the light vanished. The canopy was a solid roof of green. The ground was thick with fallen leaves, soft as a mattress under my boots. I stopped and closed my eyes. I slowed my breathing and let the sensation on my brow stretch outward like a probe. I heard it. Deep in the woods, about a mile to the northwest, there was a tiny heat point flickering. The pulse was slow, half the speed of my own heartbeat. It felt rough, like sandpaper rubbing against wood. I recognized that texture. It was the same feeling as the remnant energy at the bottom of old Joe's well. It was the warmth a human body gives off when it's been curled up in fear and cold for too long. I ran toward it. The forest grew denser and the terrain got rougher. I had to climb over rotting logs and push through thorns that tore at my pants. I didn't stop. I kept my internal gaze fixed on that heat point. Half an hour later, I reached a stone cliff. It wasn't high, maybe 20 feet, and it was covered in moss and weeds. At the base was a pile of jagged rocks. A single hand was sticking out from a gap between the stones. I rushed over and started hurling the rocks aside. Beneath them was a small, thin old man with white hair. He still had a bamboo basket strapped to his back, half filled with herbs. A heavy stone was pinning his right leg. It wasn't a massive rock, but it had caught his ankle at a cruel angle, making it impossible for him to move. The old man's lips were cracked and dry. When he saw me, his eyes lit up. He tried to say something, but his voice was nothing more than a faint hiss. I didn't waste time talking. I braced myself and heaved the stone off his leg. The old man's ankle was a mess. It had swollen to the size of a large, bruised eggplant, glowing a nasty shade of purple-black. He reached down and felt the area with trembling fingers. The bone wasn't broken, but the tendons were badly torn. He wasn't walking out of here on his own. I'll carry you, I said. I helped him up and hoisted him onto my back. He was incredibly light, like a bundle of dry firewood. He weighed almost nothing as I began the trek out of the forest. My pace was slower now, but I made sure every step was firm and steady. I couldn't afford to trip. By the time we broke through the tree line, the sun was directly overhead. A small group of people was waiting under a fake tree at the village entrance. When they spotted us, a young man charged forward. He took the old man from my back, crying out for his father. An old woman followed close behind, gasping for breath. As soon as she reached us, she collapsed onto the ground, clutching the old man's legs and sobbing with relief. Beside them stood a small child. He looked up at me with huge, dark eyes that reflected my own silhouette. I knelt down and ruffled his hair. The moment my palm touched his head, the golden line in my hand gave a sharp pulse of heat. Your father is back, I told him. The boy nodded slowly. He pulled his thumb out of his mouth and suddenly broke into a wide, radiant smile. It was like a tiny sun exploding on his dirty face. Seeing him smile, I couldn't help but let out a small grin of my own. I stood up and started walking back the way I came. I had only gone about a dozen yards when the old woman's shaky, tearful voice called out from behind me. Young man, which village are you from? What's your name? How can I ever thank you? I didn't stop, but I looked back and gave a casual wave. East end of town, the Earth God Temple. Lin Yuan, I shouted back. Once I cleared the valley between the low hills, I pulled out the stone bowl. The leaf at the bottom had fully unfurled. The veins were spreading from the center to the edges, twice as thick as they had been yesterday. A faint shimmer floated over the surface, with tiny, silver-like patterns flowing through the veins like liquid mercury. I flipped the bowl over to check the exterior. On the previously smooth ceramic surface, near the rim, several shallow scratches had appeared. They were perfectly aligned, looking as though someone had carved them with a needle. I squinted at them for a long time before I realized they weren't words. They were lines, a winding path tracing my journey from where I started this morning to the village, then into the deep woods, and finally looping back to the start. It formed a perfect circle. Inside that circle, a tiny, glowing dot marked the village's location. I stared at that dot. Suddenly, I understood. The bowl was drawing a map. Every time I answered a call for help and resolved a problem, it left a mark. These marks define my territory. In the future, if the people in those places needed me or even just thought of me, their signals would travel back along these carvings. I ran my thumb over the scratches. As my fingertip touched the fine lines, I heard voices. They were faint and distant, like people talking behind a thick wall. One voice was clearer than the rest, the hunter from the Earth God Temple. Our old man is saved. I'm going to burn incense for him tomorrow. It was the old woman. A second voice followed, younger this time. That Lin Yuan guy, why did he leave so fast? By the time I ran over, he was already out of the village. That was the young man. The third voice was the softest of all, like a child murmuring in a dream. I tucked the bowl back into my shirt. The golden pattern in my palm was twitching slightly. With every pulse, a hint of warmth drifted from the direction of that village, like a distant, invisible charcoal fire slowly burning. The sky was turning dark by the time I made it back to my town. Old Lee was waiting for me at the temple entrance, holding a bowl of stewed pig liver. He had covered it with a plate to keep it warm. When he saw me approaching, he flipped the plate off. "Quick, eat it while it's hot," he urged. I took the bowl and sat on the stone steps of the temple. The liver was stewed until it was soft and tender, melting in my mouth. The broth was a rich, dark brown, packed with ginger and dried chili peppers. The spice hit the back of my throat, making my nose sweat. I ate slowly, savoring every spoonful and chewing thoroughly before swallowing. Old Lee watched me eat while he puffed on his pipe. The embers in the bowl flickered in the twilight. "Little Yuan," he said, knocking the ash against his shoe. "You've been running around a lot lately. Looks like you're busy with something big." I finished the last of the soup and rested the empty bowl on my knees. "Just busy staying alive," I replied. Old Lee glanced at me, but didn't pry. He stood up and brushed off his pants. "If you want to stay alive, you'd better eat well. I'll save some for you tomorrow, too." He walked away, leaving me alone on the steps. The world went completely dark, and stars began to pop out one by one against the deep blue sky. I pulled the stone bowl out again. That morning, the leaf had been a pale gold. Now, it was a deep, rich gold. The light flowing through the veins was thicker, looking like hot blood pumping through an artery. In the very center of the leaf, there was a tiny protrusion, a bud that hadn't opened yet. I pressed the bowl against my chest and headed inside. 3 new sticks of incense were sitting on the altar. They had already burned down to the nubs, leaving a pile of ash on the table. The ash hadn't scattered, though. It had settled into a specific shape, a winding line with a circle at one end. It was an exact match for the carving on the bowl. I reached out and scooped up the ash. It was warm. As it touched my palm, it settled into my skin, filling the gap between the red and golden lines of my palm print. After a few seconds, the ash dissolved into my flesh. Both lines deepened in color. My brow twitched. I reached up to touch the mark. Beneath the skin, something incredibly thin was moving, like a tiny insect rolling over. As I lowered my hand, I caught a flicker of movement through the crack in the door. I stood up and pushed the door open. On the stone step sat a bamboo staff. The head of it was carved into the shape of a bird. Tucked under the staff was a slip of yellow paper with 3 words written on it. "He has moved." I flipped the paper over. The back was blank, but I caught a faint scent. It was the same sandalwood smell as my own incense, but underneath it was something else I couldn't quite identify. I looked toward the south. There was nothing but fog and the mountain path, looking like a pale gray ribbon under the moonlight. I stood there for a moment, turning the paper in my fingers, then knelt to pick up the staff. It was cool to the touch, but the bird carving still held a lingering warmth, as if someone had just been holding it. I took the staff back inside, bolted the door, and leaned it against the altar. I lay down on my straw mat, pulling the thin blanket over me and pressing the stone bowl to my heart. Before I closed my eyes, I tasted the lingering spice of the pig liver soup on my tongue. The warmth was still spreading through my mouth. "He has moved," I whispered, mimicking the tone of the note. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. Master Ming was finally making his move. The morning hadn't even broken when I woke up. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the cold that did it. It was the 2 lines in my palm. They both twitched at the exact same time, like someone had plucked 2 guitar strings simultaneously. The vibration traveled from my palm to my wrist, then shot straight up into my elbow joint. I snapped my eyes open and sat bolt upright. On the corner of the altar, the half-burnt candle from last night was still flickering in the dusty air. I looked down at my hand. The golden line was dimmer than it had been last night. It had faded from a deep gold to a pale, sickly amber, like a lamp with the wick turned down low. The red line hadn't changed. It sat there, dark and steady, etched into my skin. I clenched my fist and let go. The golden line jumped again, weaker this time. I pulled out the stone bowl to check the bead inside. The deep golden leaf at the bottom was changing. One edge of the leaf had turned dark, looking like it had been soaked in something rotten. I touched the dark spot with my fingertip. I felt a tiny, faint vibration. It felt like something was tapping twice on the back of the leaf. The village, the one to the southeast. Last night, I could feel a warm flow of energy coming from that direction. Now, that flow was thinning out. It was like someone had built a dam upstream on a small river. I tucked the bowl away, pushed open the temple door, and headed out. The sky was a dull gray. The town roosters were only on their second crow. I avoided the main road, hopping over a low ridge at the edge of town and taking a shortcut along the mountain spine. The wind was heavy this morning, blowing in from the north. It was biting cold. Every breath felt like swallowing a mouthful of ice water. I reached the village in less than an hour. The locust tree was still there. The people were still there. But the atmosphere had shifted. The old woman who had been wailing yesterday was sitting on her doorstep today. She held a basket of beans, picking through them one by one. Her fingers moved, but her eyes were dead. She was staring at a crack in the ground, lost. In the yard, a young man was chopping wood. The axe rose and fell. He split one log, then another. On the third swing, he missed. The wood chip flew 10 feet away, but he didn't even look at it. He just stood there, staring at nothing. I walked up to the locust tree and stopped. I didn't say a word. The pink line on my brow twitched outward like a feeler, sensing the air, then snapped back. It had hit something. It felt cold and slick, like the moss growing on a stone in the shade. It was a thin layer, draped over the entire village like an invisible spiderweb. It stretched from this tree at the entrance all the way to the roof of the last house in the back. I reached up to touch the air above my head. There was nothing to feel, but the golden line in my palm dimmed the moment my hand passed through that invisible layer. It flickered like an oil lamp hit by a sudden gust of wind. "Did you sleep well last night?" I asked the young man in the yard. He straightened his back. He had deep, dark circles under his eyes. "No," he muttered. "I dreamed all night. I dreamed someone was standing outside my window, tapping on the glass. He tapped the whole night. I went out to look, but no one was there. As soon as I lay back down, the tapping started again. It was happening at every house. I didn't get a wink of sleep. I asked a few more villagers. It was the same story. Everything was fine until they closed their eyes. Then came the tapping. Asterisk thump, 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 asterisk rhythmic. Patient. Like someone knocking on a window frame with a paper-wrapped knuckle. Different windows, but the same sound. There was only one exception. I found the barefoot little boy in the corner of a yard. He was squatting by a chicken coop, teasing ants with a blade of grass. His face was clean, and his eyes were bright. "Big brother," he shouted, running toward me. His bare feet made a slapping sound on the mud. I slept great last night. I didn't hear any tapping. I knelt down to look at him. Right in the center of his forehead, there was a very faint mark. It was in the exact same spot as the pink line on my brow. It was almost transparent, nearly impossible to see if you weren't looking for it. But there was a spark of warmth inside it. As I got closer, that warmth gave off a tiny glow. "Did you have a dream?" I asked. The boy thought for a second. "I had one. I dreamed a big brother was standing at my door. His back was to me. He had a bamboo staff on his shoulder, and there was a bird on the staff." My chest tightened. I patted the boy's head, stood up, and walked deeper into the village. I followed the pull of the line on my brow. I crossed half the village and stopped at a withered well. The stone rim was polished smooth by years of rain. A thick wooden board covered the opening, held down by 2 heavy stones. Between the board and the stone rim, a thin wisp of black smoke was drifting out. I knelt to look closer. The smoke was faint, like the last trail of scent from a dying incense stick. It vanished into the air the moment it escaped. I used the tip of my knife to pry the board open, just a crack. I looked down. It was black, a deep, bottomless black. But in the center of that darkness, there was a point of light. It was the size of a match head, pulsing in and out. The rhythm matched the tapping sound the villagers had heard. I pulled out the stone bowl. The darkened edge of the leaf inside suddenly flared with light. A pale golden glow rose from the bead, forming a ring around the rim of the bowl. The glow reached out toward the well. When that light touched the black smoke, the smoke recoiled. It shrank back inside the rim, hiding like a creature that feared the sun. With the smoke gone, I saw them. There were marks on the inner wall of the well. Fingerprints. 5 of them. They were the prints of an adult man, pressed deep into the wet mud of the well wall. The prints were pointing upward. It looked like someone had been struggling to climb out, clawing at the mud to pull themselves up, but they hadn't made it. I slid the board back and replaced the stones. I walked a circle around the well. There were footprints in the mud nearby. They were light, like the brush of a feather. The toes were all pointed toward the well. I knelt to measure them. They were smaller than my feet, but larger than the boy's. They looked like the feet of a teenager. Every set of prints pointed toward the water. None pointed away. It was as if these people had walked to the edge of the well and simply vanished. Or maybe they had never left. I started walking back through the village. Every time I passed a house, the line on my brow shivered. Behind every window, there was an invisible thread. The other end of those threads was anchored at the bottom of that withered well. It was a web, stretching out to hook into the nerves of every sleeping person in town. I stopped under the locust tree at the village entrance. I took one last look at the stone bowl. The dark patch on the leaf had grown again. It was spreading like frost across a window pane. The golden line in my palm was even fainter now, looking like a scar that was about to heal and disappear. Someone was reeling in the lines. Someone at the bottom of that well, miles away from me, was using those invisible threads to steal the blessings and intentions I had gathered. Yesterday, the old woman said she would burn incense for me. This morning, she was staring into space, her mind a blank. The thought had been hijacked. I tucked the bowl back into my robe and looked toward the village one last time. The little boy was standing at his gate, watching me. He was still barefoot, clutching his blade of grass. He waved it at me. I gave him a single, sharp nod and turned away. I turned and headed back toward my own town. My pace was slow, half the speed of my journey there. I walked and I thought. Xianxing's method was cultivation, nurturing something until it was ripe, then refining it to consume. Mr. Ming's method was dismantling, tearing things out by the roots once they had already grown. Xianxing did his own dirty work with gray threads and paper charms. Mr. Ming sent others. He sent old Huai to deliver messages, and he used that well to resolve his own concerns. So far, Mr. Ming hadn't even shown his face, yet his influence was already taking hold. I wondered if old Huai knew what was at the bottom of that well. He was the one who left the bamboo staff and the yellow paper last night. He was the one who pointed me toward the well today. Was it his doing, or was Mr. Ming pulling his strings too? I didn't have the answer, but I remembered the rhythm of that flickering light at the bottom of the well. Tap, tap, tap. A pause for a breath. Tap, tap, tap. Another pause. It was persistent. It felt like someone using a paper stick to knock on a tightly locked door, waiting for the person inside to open up. The sun was high by the time I reached the Earth God Temple. I pushed the door open and noticed something new on the offering table. It was a fresh clay jar. The mouth was plugged with a red cloth, held down by a small stone. Tucked under the stone was a slip of paper. I picked it up. For words were written there. Changed to another well. I recognized the handwriting. It was the same hand that wrote the note under old Huai's staff. Same person, same brushwork. I flipped the paper over and burned it. I pulled the red plug and sniffed the jar. A heavy medicinal scent hit me, bitter as a concentrated brew of coptis root. I poured the contents out to look. It was a small pile of black soil, damp and clumpy. Mixed into the dirt were grains of fine sand that caught the sunlight, reflecting a cold, iron-gray metallic sheen. I put the soil back, resealed the jar, and set it in the corner of the table. I crouched there for a moment, lost in thought. I pulled a stick of incense from my robe and stuck it in my mouth like a cigarette, staring into space. Changed to another well. Old Huai wanted me to move on. He was telling me that the well had been claimed by someone else, and I couldn't take it back. He wanted me to plant my roots somewhere else. But I didn't want to change. When I hunted in the mountains and found a trail where someone had set a trap, I didn't just find a new path. I dismantled the trap, found the person who set it, and then I walked that path anyway. I stood up, the incense still between my teeth, and walked back out. This time, I didn't head southeast. I went north. I passed the crooked walnut tree and the stone crevice, reaching the hollow where the old elm tree stood. The shards of Xianxin's 7 bowls were still scattered on the ground. The powder had been washed away by the rain, mixing into the mud until its color vanished. The straw effigies were gone. The hollow was empty, save for the rustling of the elm's canopy in the wind. I knelt at the edge of the hollow and placed my stone bowl on the ground. I plucked 3 grass stalks and balanced them in a triangle across the rim. I closed my eyes. The fine root hairs in my brow spread out. They felt like real roots searching through the darkness in every direction. They brushed past the elm, through the stone crevice, under the walnut tree, and up toward the northern mountain ridge. At the furthest edge of my reach, the roots hit a hard barrier. It felt like a wall growing straight out of the earth, blocking the path toward Green Wolf Mountain. Behind that wall, something was moving. It was heavy, massive. It didn't move fast, but every step was solid and deliberate, like a bear lumbering through the woods. I opened my eyes. I took the grass stalks off the bowl, tucked the bowl away, and slapped the dust off my leggings. I couldn't go around it. That wall stretched across the entire northern route. But I didn't need to go around. I didn't need to climb it yet. I just needed to grow tall enough to see what was on the other side. As I left the hollow, I bent down near the stone crevice and picked up a small rock. It was blue-green with sharp edges. On the back, a thin vein of white quartz ran perfectly from one side to the other. I gripped it tight and slipped it into my pocket. By the time I got back to town, the setting sun was stretching the shadow of the old locust tree into a long, dark road. I walked right down the center of that shadow. As I passed the Lame's house, the smell of stewed meat drifted over the wall, but I didn't stop. Near the general store, the owner's wife was closing up. She saw me and shouted, "Little Yi, someone left something at your temple door again." I hurried back. A small basket sat on the stone steps, lined with a clean lotus leaf. Inside were 3 white steam buns. They were still hot, wisps of steam curling through the gaps in the leaves. Next to the basket, someone had traced words into the dirt with a twig. Asterisk thanks for my old man. Lu Village, Li Shun, asterisk. I stared at the writing for a long time. Lu Village. Among the 7 families I had helped escape yesterday, one was named Li. The wife of that family had walked 5 miles today just to bring me 3 buns. I picked one up and took a bite. It was soft and chewy, with the natural sweetness of fresh wheat bleeding out as I ate. I sat on the steps, leaning my back against the temple door, and finished all 3. I licked the crumbs from my fingers and went inside. I pulled out the stone bowl. The dark patch on the leaf inside the bead had suddenly shrunk. It was as if a layer of frost had been melted by the sun, revealing the golden flesh beneath. The golden lines in my palm brightened, not quite back to their original strength, but far better than at noon. They glowed like a lamp wick that had just been refilled with oil. I pressed the bowl against my chest and lay down in the hay, closing my eyes. The wall to the north was still there, but the heavy thing moving behind it hadn't come any closer tonight. It had stopped. It was waiting. I rolled over to face the wall and pulled my blanket up to my chin. I could wait too. The thing in the well wasn't going back tonight. I didn't sleep deeply. My brow had been twitching all day, and in the silence of the night, the sensation grew tense. It felt like a plucked string vibrating in the dark. I counted my heartbeats. Around the 300th mark, a surge of warmth flooded into my brow. It was hot and slightly sweet, like someone had poured a bowl of brown sugar water directly into my brain. I snapped awake. The candle on the altar was still burning, the flame steady. The warmth traveled down my nose, into my throat, circled my chest, and finally settled in my stomach. It felt exactly like the solid, grounded comfort of eating a bowl of hot porridge. I sat up and touched my belly. Through my clothes, I could feel a gentle warmth spinning slowly inside me, like a tiny vortex. I looked at the stone bowl. The dark edge on the leaf had shrunk by half again, revealing a large patch of shimmering gold. The light flowing through the leaf's veins was twice as fast as it had been during the day, driven by a new, powerful force. The small protrusion in the center of the leaf was slightly larger than yesterday. It bulged like a single grain of parboiled rice. I sat there for a while, clutching the stone bowl, memorizing the sensation of that warm current flowing through my body. It had settled about 2 inches above my navel. It didn't shift. It sat there like a fixed anchor. I tried to nudge the vortex with my mind, and it spun a fraction faster before slowing back down to its original, steady rhythm. When the sky began to gray at dawn, I pushed the door open and stepped out. White beads of dew hung heavy on the blades of grass. I stepped through the corpse grass and climbed the slope behind the earth god temple. I sat down facing east. The moment the sun broke over the mountain ridge, the anchor in my brow flared with warmth. It happened exactly at sunrise, as if something had clicked into place the very second the light hit. I closed my eyes. This time, the voices I heard were many times clearer and more numerous than the day before. In a village 15 miles away, an old woman got up and started the fire in her stove. I could hear her thoughts clearly. She wanted to steam a pot of buns today and bring some to the boy at the temple. In another house, a young man shouldered his hoe to head into the fields. As he passed his front door, he looked toward the old forest I had visited. He thought about how fast that hunter had run the day before and marveled at my stamina. The voices of children were the lightest, drifting through the morning air like sleep talk. One asked if the older brother would come back today. These voices didn't enter through my forehead. They were pulled in by that small vortex in my abdomen, that new anchor point. Every sentence that fell and spun once through the vortex, and the warmth spread out from there. It followed my blood, traveling to the 2 lines in my palms, to the pink mark on my brow, and into the very marrow of my bones. I sat on that hillside for 2 hours until the sun was high, then stood up and walked back. A basket was already sitting on the stone steps of the temple. It was covered with a white cloth. When I lifted it, I found 6 steaming white buns resting on freshly picked lotus leaves. Beside the buns was a small jar of pickled radishes. The jar was sealed with chili oil, and the radishes were sliced thin, smelling sour and spicy. I crouched on the steps and ate them one by one, sandwiching the radishes inside the buns. They were perfectly crunchy. Once I finished, I put the empty basket inside the temple door and pulled out the stone bowl. The scratches on the bowl's surface had increased. A nudge had appeared next to the circle marking the southeast direction, right outside the old woman's courtyard. Several new fine lines branched out, curving toward a place I hadn't visited yet. It was to the southwest, across a mountain hollow, about 3 or 4 miles away. I stared at the blank space in the southwest for a moment, tucked the bowl into my shirt, and started walking. After an hour of hiking over a rocky ridge, a flat basin appeared before me. About a dozen houses were clustered together, all made of packed earth with thick thatched roofs. A row of persimmon trees stood at the village entrance, heavy with green, unripe fruit. Before I even entered the village, the golden lines in my palms flared hot. The vortex in my gut spun half a turn, catching a faint signal. Someone in this village was crying. It wasn't a loud, wailing sob. It was a suppressed, choked sound, held tight in the chest. The sound came from a house right in the middle of the village. It drifted past the persimmon trees, around the threshing floor, and over the stone mill, drilling straight into the reception range of my brow. I quickened my pace. The courtyard gate was half open. I pushed it and saw a woman in her 30s crouching by a water well. Her hands covered her face, and her shoulders shook with every sob. An empty wooden bucket sat on the well's edge. The rope trailed down into the depths, pulled taut as if something heavy was hanging on the other end. "What happened?" I asked. The woman looked up. Her eyes were terrifyingly red, and her lips trembled. She pointed at the well. "My husband," she whispered. "He went to get water this morning. He went down and never came back up. I called for him, but he didn't answer. I looked down, but I walked to the edge and peered inside. The water was murky, looking like it had been violently stirred. A layer of fine grass clippings and mud foam floated on the surface. But deep in the water, something was moving. It was a dark red shadow. It wasn't large. It was curled up, crawling slowly over the mud at the very bottom like an underdeveloped insect. I caught a scent. Rust. It was the exact same smell I had found in the cracks of the well at Boss Zhao's inn, but it was weaker, faint, like a residue left behind after being soaked for days. Go get your husband out of the house, I told her, standing up. Don't stay by the well. The woman stood up, dazed, and walked toward the house, her hands shaking as she pushed the door. I pulled a bun from my shirt, the one left over from breakfast, broke it into pieces, and scattered it around the well. When the crumbs hit the well's rim, a wisp of extremely faint black smoke rose. It drifted up half a foot and vanished. I crouched down and placed the stone bowl on my knee, aiming the opening toward the well. The leaf inside the bead flashed. A ripple of golden light spread out from the rim of the bowl, hugging the ground like a wave. When the light hit the well, several marks lit up on the inner clay walls. They were fingerprints. They were smaller than the ones in the well from yesterday, looking like a woman's fingers. These prints pointed downward, as if someone had been sliding their fingers down the inside of the wall. It was the opposite of the southeast well. In that one, the prints pointed up, like someone was climbing out. Here, the prints pointed down. Someone was falling in. I pulled the bowl back and stood up, brushing the dirt off my knees. The woman had brought her husband out. He was a dark, thin man with skin as rough as tree bark. He stood at the door, looking back and forth between the well and me. What is it? He muttered. What's in the well? I walked up to him and looked him in the eye. Did you dream last night? The man blinked, startled. I did. I dreamed someone crawled out of the well. They were covered in water and kept pulling me down. Did you struggle? I did. I couldn't get away. Then, he scratched the back of his head. Then it was dawn. I was covered in sweat. I nodded and walked back to the well. I took 3 sticks of incense from my robe, lit them, and stuck them into the mud by the rim. 3 plumes of smoke rose, but they didn't scatter. They dove straight into the well like 3 white ropes searching the bottom. The smoke stopped right at the water's surface, coiling into a tight ball. It didn't sink, and it didn't dissipate. It just hung there. I pulled out the green stone I had found in the rock crevice yesterday, the one with the white quartz vein. I squeezed it in my palm until it was warm, then tossed it into the well. The splash was short, a sharp thud. But immediately after, a second sound came from the bottom, a muffled groan, like something had been hit and was recoiling. The ball of smoke on the surface suddenly plunged into the water and shattered. The murky water churned where the smoke hit, throwing up fine bubbles. Once the bubbles cleared, the water looked a layer cleaner. I turned the stone bowl toward the well. The edges of the leaf inside the bead shrank again. But this time, it didn't stop. The gold on the leaf's surface began to migrate from the edges toward the center, condensing into a single, razor-thin golden line. The golden line flowed along the veins of the leaf, gathering into a small, rice-sized protrusion. As the gold merged into it, the bump pulsed violently and swelled. It doubled in size, growing from the size of a grain of rice to that of a soybean. Its shape shifted from a perfect circle to an oval, like a tiny egg. I pulled the stone bowl back and tucked it away. I looked at the couple, my voice firm. I told them to seal the well for 3 days. During that time, they weren't to draw any water, and they definitely weren't to look down into it. Once the sun set, they had to stay inside their house. The man hesitated, his mouth hanging open. He asked me how they were supposed to get water to drink. I reached into my robe and pulled out the clay jar old Hua had given me. I popped the red cloth plug and checked the dark soil inside. After a moment of thought, I poured half of the soil out. I mixed the remaining half with clear water, stirring it until the liquid turned a dull, metallic iron gray. I walked to the edge of the well and poured the entire jar of gray water into the depths. The sound it made hitting the bottom was different this time, muffled, heavier than a stone, followed by a faint, rasping hiss. It sounded like sandpaper rubbing against dry wood. The moment the water settled, the sharp scent of rust vanished from the air. All that remained was the fresh smell of damp earth and clean well water. I put the empty jar away. I told them that in 3 days, the water in this well would be sweeter than it had ever been. When that happened, all they had to do was bring a bucket of that water to the earth god temple in town. The couple exchanged a look. The wife reacted first, dropping to her knees by the well. She pressed her palms together in a prayer. She called me her savior and asked for my name and where I came from. I was already at the courtyard gate. I didn't stop, just waved a hand over my shoulder. I told them my name was Yi Chun from the Earth God Temple. As I walked out of the village, I heard the man's gravelly voice shouting behind me. He promised he wouldn't forget me. He yelled that once the water turned sweet, he'd deliver it to me personally. When I reached the mountain ridge, I pulled out the stone bowl for a quick look. The oval protrusion at the bottom was starting to turn red. It shifted from a pale pink to a fleshy tone, the exact color of the raw skin revealed on my brow after that pink line had faded. It looked like a developing seed, pushing outward and causing the surface of the leaf to bulge. The golden patterns on my palm throbbed 3 times. With every pulse, a wave of heat surged back from the direction of that village. It felt as if 3 invisible bridges had been built between me and that family. The red line next to the gold patterns flickered too, but its rhythm was a beat slower, like a fading echo. I stood on the ridge and looked into the distance. The northern mountain range was sharp and piercing under the afternoon sun. The wall toward Green Wolf Mountain was still there, but the bear behind it wasn't moving today. It seemed to be crouching at the base of the wall, its heavy breathing traveling along the ground like a trapped beast hiding in the shadows. But I sensed something else. Near the bottom of that wall, close to the earth, there was a draft. A tiny, razor-thin wind was leaking through, like light peeking under a door. Wrapped inside that light was a faint heat. It felt exactly like the temperature of the small black tortoise inside my chest. I tucked the stone bowl away and headed back toward my town. When I passed the crooked walnut tree, I stopped to check the 3 stones. The paper ash was still piled there, but something new was resting in the gray debris, a black feather. It was about the length of my thumb, with a clean, sharp break at the quill, as if someone had placed it there intentionally. I picked it up and held it against the sunlight. The spine of the feather was iron gray, but the downy fluff on the sides shimmered with a very faint golden undertone. I brought it to my nose. It carried a scent, a light, airy sandalwood. It was the exact same smell as the incense I burned on my altar every day. I tucked the feather behind my ear and kept walking. The sun stretched my shadow across the rutted dirt road, making it grow long and short as I moved. As I crossed the final ridge, a sudden sound echoed from behind me. It didn't come from the village in the hollow. It came from much further away, from the north, from Green Wolf Mountain. It was a heavy, dull thud, like a fist slamming against a thick wooden board. I froze and looked back. The northern ridgeline was empty. Under the gray-blue sky, only a few clouds drifted slowly. But the vortex inside my chest spun half a turn faster, like a heart constricting in a moment of sudden fright. After the thud, everything went silent. The wind died down. Even the distant birds stopped singing. The silence lasted for about 3 breaths. Then, the wind kicked up again, flattening the wild grass by the roadside. I took the black feather from behind my ear and looked at it again. The golden sheen on the spine caught the light for a second, looking like the glint in a person's eye when they squint. I shoved the feather into my pocket and picked up the pace. Someone had knocked on that wall from the outside today. I had to get back to the Earth God Temple before dark. Something told me someone might be coming to find me tonight.